Among other public buildings in a certain town, it boasts one of which is common to most towns, to wit, a workhouse. And in this workhouse was born the item of mortality named Oliver Twist. For some time he lay gasping on a little flock mattress, rather unequally poised between this world and the next. Then, after a few struggles, he breathed, sneezed, and cried. As Oliver gave this first proof of the free and proper action of his lungs, the pale face of a young female was raised feebly from the pillow, and a faint voice imperfectly articulated the words, "Let me see the child and die." The surgeon had been sitting with his face turned towards the fire, but as the young woman spoke, he rose and said, "Oh, you must not talk about dying yet." "Lord bless her dear heart, no," interposed the nurse. "When she has lived as long as I have, sir, and had 13 children of her own, and all of them dead except 2, and them in the workhouse with me, she'll know better than to take on in that way, bless her dear heart. Think what it is to be a mother, there's a dear young lamb, do." Apparently this consolatory perspective of a mother's prospects failed in producing its due effect. The patient shook her head and stretched out her hand towards the child. The surgeon deposited it in her arms. She imprinted her cold white lips passionately on its forehead, passed her hands over her face, gazed wildly round, shuddered, fell back, and died. The surgeon leant over the body and raised the left hand. "The old story," he said, shaking his head. "No wedding ring, I see. Good night." Oliver cried lustily. If he could have known that he was an orphan, left to the tender mercies of churchwardens and overseers, perhaps he would have cried the louder. Oliver Twist's 9th birthday found him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature, and decidedly small in circumference. But nature, or inheritance, had implanted a good, sturdy spirit in Oliver's breast, and it had plenty of room to expand, thanks to the spare diet of the parish farm, where he had been brought up. And perhaps to this circumstance may be attributed his having any 9th birthday at all. Be this as it may, however, it was his 9th birthday, and he was keeping it in the coal cellar with a select party of 2 other young gentlemen who, after participating with him in a sound thrashing, had been locked up therein for atrociously presuming to be hungry, when Mrs. Mann, the good lady of the house, was unexpectedly startled by the apparition of Mr. Bumble, the beadle, striving to undo the wicket of the garden gate. Mr. Bumble was a fat man, and a choleric one, so he gave the wicket a tremendous shake, and then bestowed upon it a kick, which could have emanated from no leg but a beadle's. Mrs. Mann ushered the beadle into a small parlour with a brick floor, placed a seat for him, and officiously deposited his cocked hat and cane on the table before him. "Now about business," said the beadle, taking out a leathern pocket-book. "The child that was half-baptized Oliver Twist is 9-year-old today." "Bless him," interposed Mrs. Mann, inflaming her left eye with the corner of her apron. "And notwithstanding a offered reward of £10, which was afterwards increased to £20, we have never been able to discover who is his father, or what was his mother's settlement, name, or condition. Oliver being now too old to remain here, at the parish farm, the board have determined to have him back into the workhouse, and I have come out myself to take him there. So let me see him at once." "I'll fetch him directly," said Mrs. Mann, leaving the room for that purpose, and Oliver was led into the room by his benevolent protectress. "Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver," said Mrs. Mann. "Will you go along with me, Oliver?" said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice. Oliver was about to say he would go along with anybody with great readiness, when, glancing upward, he caught sight of Mrs. Mann, who had got behind the beadle's chair, and was shaking her fist at him with furious countenance. "Will she go with me?" inquired poor Oliver.
"No, she can't," replied Mr. Bumble, "but she'll come back and see her sometime."
This was no very great consolation to the child, but young as he was, he had sense enough to make a feint of feeling great regret at going away. It was no very difficult matter for the boy to call tears into his eyes. Hunger and recent ill-usage are great assistants if you want to cry. Mrs. Mann gave him 1,000 embraces, and, what Oliver wanted a great deal more, a piece of bread and butter. He was then led away by Mr. Bumble from the wretched home, where one kind word or look had never lighted the gloom of his infant years. The room in which the boys were fed in the workhouse was a large stone hall, with a copper at one end, out of which the master ladled the gruel at meal-times, of which a composition each boy had one porringer and no more, except on festive occasions, and then he had 2 ounces and a quarter of bread besides. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At last they got so voracious and wild with hunger that a council was held. Lots were cast. Who should walk up to the master after supper that evening and ask for more? And it fell to Oliver Twist. The evening arrived. The master stationed himself at the copper. The gruel was served out, and a long grace was said over the short commons. The gruel disappeared. The boys whispered to each other and winked at Oliver, while his next neighbours nudged him. Child as he was so desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table, and advancing to the master, basin and spoon in hand, said, somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds, and then clung for support to the copper. "What?" said the master at length, in a faint voice. "Please, sir, I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle, pinioned him in his arms, and shrieked aloud for the beadle. Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement. An animated discussion took place. Oliver was ordered in instant confinement, and a bill was next morning pasted on the outside of the gate, offering a reward of £5 to anybody who would take Oliver Twist off the hands of the parish. In other words, £5 and Oliver Twist were offered to any man or woman who wanted an apprentice to any trade, business, or calling. Mr. Bumble had been dispatched to make various preliminary inquiries, with a view of finding out some captain or other who wanted a cabin boy without any friends, and was returning to the workhouse when he encountered at the gate no less a person than Mr. Sowerberry, the parochial undertaker. "I have taken the measure of the 2 women that died last night, Mr. Bumble," said the undertaker. "You'll make your fortune, Mr. Sowerberry." "Think so? The prices allowed by the workhouse board are very small, Mr. Bumble." "So are the coffins," replied the beadle, with as precisely as near an approach to a laugh as a great official ought to indulge in. Mr. Sowerberry was much tickled at this, and laughed a long time without cessation. "By the by, you don't know anyone who wants a boy, do you? A parochial apprentice who is at present a dead weight, a millstone, as I might say, round the parochial throat. Liberal terms, Mr. Sowerberry, liberal terms." "Gadso," said the undertaker, taking Mr. Bumble by the gilt-edged lapel of his official coat. "That's just the very thing I wanted to speak to you about. You know, Mr. Bumble, I pay a good deal towards the poor's rates."
"Oh," said Mr. Bumble. "Well?"
"Well, I was thinking that if I pay so much towards 'em, I've got a right to get as much out of 'em as I can, Mr. Bumble, and so I think I'll take the boy myself." It was arranged that Oliver should go to him that evening, upon liking, a phrase which means, in the case of a parish apprentice, that if the master find upon a short trial that he can get enough work out of a boy without putting too much food into him, he shall have him for a term of years to do what he likes with. The undertaker had just put up the shutters of his shop when Mr. Bumble entered. "Aha! Is that you, Bumble?"
"No one else, Mr. Sowerberry. Here, I've brought the boy."
Oliver made a bow.
"Oh, that's the boy, is it? Mrs. Sowerberry, will you have the goodness to come here a moment, my dear?"
Mrs. Sowerberry emerged from a little room behind the shop and presented the form of a short, thin, squeezed-up woman with a vixenish countenance.
"My dear," said Mr. Sowerberry deferentially, "this is the boy from the workhouse that I told you of."
Oliver bowed again.
"Dear me,"
said the undertaker's wife.
"he's very small."
"Why, he is rather small," replied Mr. Bumble, looking at Oliver as if it were his fault that he was no bigger. "But he'll grow, Mrs. Sowerberry. He'll grow."
"I dare say he will," replied the lady pettishly, "on our victuals and our drink. There, get downstairs, little bag of bones."
With this, the undertaker's wife opened a side door and pushed Oliver down a steep flight of stairs into a stone cell, damp and dark, forming the anteroom of the coal cellar and denominated kitchen, wherein sat Charlotte, a slatternly girl in shoes down at heel and blue worsted stockings very much out of repair.
"Here, Charlotte,"
said Mrs. Sowerberry, who had followed Oliver down.
"give this boy some of the coal bits that were put by for Trip. He hasn't come home since this morning, so he may go without 'em. I dare say the boy isn't too dainty to eat 'em, are you, boy?"
"Well," she continued, when Oliver had finished his supper, which she had regarded in silent horror and with fearful auguries of his future appetite.
"have you done?"
There being nothing eatable within his reach, Oliver replied in the affirmative.
"Then come with me,"
said Mrs. Sowerberry, taking up a dim and dirty lamp and leading the way upstairs.
"Your bed's under the counter. You don't mind sleeping among the coffins, I suppose, but it doesn't much matter whether you do or you don't, for you can't sleep anywhere else. Come, don't keep me here all night."
Oliver lingered no longer, but meekly followed his new mistress. Oliver was awakened in the morning by a loud knocking at the outside of the shop door, which, before he could huddle on his clothes and go downstairs, was repeated in an angry and impetuous manner about 25 times.
"Open the door, will you?"
cried the voice, which belonged to the legs which had kicked at the door. I will directly, sir," replied Oliver, and he drew back the bolts with a trembling hand and opened the door. Oliver glanced up the street, and nobody did he see but a big charity boy, sitting on a post in front of the house, eating a slice of bread and butter, which he cut into wedges the size of his mouth with a clasp knife, and then consumed with great dexterity. "I beg your pardon, sir," said Oliver at length, seeing that no other visitor made his appearance. "Did you knock?"
"You don't know who I am, I suppose, work ass,"
said the charity boy, descending from the top of the post. "No, sir," replied Oliver.
"I'm Mr. Claypole," said the charity boy, "and you're under me. Take down the shutters, you idle young ruffian."
With this, Mr. Claypole administered a kick to Oliver and entered the shop. Noah was a charity boy, but not a workhouse orphan. No chance child was he, for he could trace his genealogy all the way back to his parents, who lived hard by, his mother being a washerwoman and his father a drunken soldier, discharged with a wooden leg and a diurnal pension of twopence halfpenny and an unstatable fraction. The shop boys in the neighbourhood had long been in the habit of branding Noah in the public streets with the ignominious epithets of Leathers, Charity, and the like, and Noah had borne them without reply. But now that fortune had cast in his way a nameless orphan, at whom even the meanest could point a finger of scorn, he retorted on him with interest. The month's trial over, Oliver was formally apprenticed. It was a nice, sickly season just at this time. In commercial phrase, coffins were looking up, and in the course of a few weeks Oliver acquired a great deal of experience. For many months he continued meekly to submit to the domination and ill-treatment of Noah Claypole. Charlotte treated him ill because Noah did, and Mrs. Sowerberry was his decided enemy because Mr. Sowerberry was disposed to be his friend. So between these three on one side, and a glut of funerals on the other, Oliver was not altogether as comfortable as the hungry pig was when he was shut up by mistake in the grain department of a brewery. And now I come to a very important passage in Oliver's history, for I have to record an act which indirectly produced a material change in all his future prospects and proceedings. One day, Oliver and Noah had descended into the kitchen to banquet upon 1.5 pounds of the worst end of the neck, when Charlotte, being called out of the way, there ensued a brief interval of time which Noah Claypole, being hungry and vicious, considered he could not possibly devote to a worthier purpose than aggravating and tantalizing young Oliver Twist. Intent upon this innocent amusement, Noah got rather personal.
"Workhouse, how's your mother?"
"She's dead," replied Oliver. "Don't you say anything about her to me."
"You know, Workhouse, you don't can't be up now, but you must know, Workhouse, your mother was regular right down bad 'un."
"What did you say?" inquired Oliver, looking up very quickly.
"Regular right down bad 'un, Workhouse," replied Noah coolly. "It's a great deal better, Workhouse, that she died when she did. Oh, she'd have been hard labouring in Broadwell, or transported, or hung, which is more likely than either, isn't it, eh?"
Crimson with fury, Oliver started up, overthrew the chair and table, seized Noah by the throat, shook him in the violence of his rage till his teeth chattered in his head, and collecting his whole force into one heavy blow, felled him to the ground.
"He'll murder me! Charlotte, missus! Here's the new boy murdering of me! Help! Help!"
Noah's shouts were responded to by a loud scream from Charlotte and a louder from Mrs. Sowerberry, the former of whom rushed into the kitchen by the side door, while the latter paused on the staircase till she was quite certain it was consistent with the preservation of human life to come further down.
"Oh, you little wretch!"
screamed Charlotte, seizing Oliver with her utmost force.
"Oh, you little ungrateful, murderous, horrid villain!"
And between every syllable Charlotte gave Oliver a blow with all her might. Charlotte's fist was by no means a light one, but lest it should not be effectual in calming Oliver's wrath, Mrs. Sowerberry plunged into the kitchen and assisted to hold him with one hand while she scratched his face with the other. In this favourable position of affairs, Noah rose from the ground and pommelled him from behind. This was rather too violent exercise to last long. When they were all wearied out and could tear and beat no longer, they dragged Oliver, struggling and shouting, but nothing daunted, into the dust cellar, and there locked him up.
"Run to Mr. Bumble, Noah,"
said Mrs. Sowerberry,
and tell him to come here directly, and not to lose a minute."
Noah Claypole ran along the streets at his swiftest pace, and paused not once for breath until he reached the workhouse gate. Having rested here for a minute or so to collect a good burst of sobs and an imposing show of tears and terror, he knocked loudly at the wicket, and presented such a rueful face to the aged pauper who opened it, that even he, who saw nothing but rueful faces about him at the best of times, started back in astonishment.
"Why, what's the matter with the boy?"
said the old pauper.
"Mr. Bumble! Mr. Bumble!"
cried Noah, with a well-affected dismay, and in tones so loud and agitated that they not only caught the ear of Mr. Bumble himself, who happened to be hard by, but alarmed him so much that he rushed into the yard without his cocked hat.
"Oh, Mr. Bumble, sir! Oliver, sir! Oliver's—"
What? Imposed Mr. Bumble with a gleam of pleasure in his eye. "Not run away? He hasn't run away, has he, Noah?"
"No, sir, no, not run away, sir, but he's turned vicious. He tried to murder me, sir, and he tried to murder Charlotte, and then Mrs. Oh, what a dreadful pain it is, such agony, please, sir."
When Noah saw that the intelligence he communicated perfectly paralysed Mr. Bumble, he imparted additional effect thereunto by bewailing his dreadful wounds 10 times louder than before. Shortly, Mr. Bumble and Noah Claypole betook themselves with all speed to the undertaker's shop, where the position of affairs had not at all improved, and Oliver kicked with vigour at the cellar door. The accounts of his ferocity, as related by Mrs. Sowerberry and Charlotte, were all so startling a nature that Mr. Bumble judged it prudent to, parley before opening the door. Applying his mouth to the keyhole, he said in a deep and impressive tone,
"Oliver!"
"Come, you let me out," replied Oliver from the inside.
Do you know this her voice, Oliver?
Yes, replied Oliver.
Aren't you afraid of it, sir? Ain't you a trembling while they speak, sir?
No, replied Oliver boldly. An answer so different from the one he had expected to elicit, and was in the habit of receiving, staggered Mr. Bumble not a little. He stepped back from the keyhole, drew himself up to his full height, and looked from one to another of the three bystanders in mute astonishment.
"Oh, you know, Mr. Bumble, he must be mad," said Mrs. Sowerberry. "No boy in half his senses could venture to speak so to you."
It's not madness, ma'am, replied Mr. Bumble after a few moments of deep meditation. It's meat.
"What?"
exclaimed Mrs. Sowerberry.
Meat, ma'am, meat, replied Mr. Bumble with stern emphasis. You've overfed him, ma'am. You've raised a artificial soul and spirit in him, unbecoming in a person of his condition. What have paupers to do with soul or spirit? It's quite enough that we let him have live bodies. If you had kept the boy on gruel, ma'am, this would never have happened.
Dear, dear, ejaculated Mrs. Sowerberry, piously raising her eyes to the kitchen ceiling.
"This comes of being liberal."
Sowerberry returned at this juncture, Oliver's offence having been explained to him with such exaggerations as the ladies thought best calculated to rouse his ire. He unlocked the cellar door in a twinkling, and dragged his rebellious apprentice out by the collar. "Now you are a nice young feller, ain't you?" said Sowerberry, giving Oliver a shake and a box on the ear. "He called my mother names," replied Oliver.
"Well, and what if he did, you little ungrateful wretch?" said Mrs. Sowerberry. "She deserved what he said and worse."
"She didn't," said Oliver.
"She did," said Mrs. Sowerberry.
"It's a lie," said Oliver. Mrs. Sowerberry burst into a flood of tears. This flood of tears left Mr. Sowerberry no alternative. If he had hesitated for one instant to punish Oliver most severely, it must be quite clear that he would have been, according to all precedents in disputes of matrimony, established a brute, an unnatural husband, an insulting creature, a base imitation of a man, and various other agreeable characters too numerous for recital. So he at once gave Oliver a drubbing, which satisfied even Mrs. Sowerberry herself, and rendered Mr. Bumble's subsequent application of the parochial cane rather unnecessary. It was not until he was left alone that night, in the silence and stillness of the gloomy workshop of the undertaker, that Oliver gave way to the feelings which the day's treatment may be supposed likely to have awakened in a mere child. He had listened to their taunts with a look of contempt. He had borne the lash without a cry, for he felt that pride swelling in his heart which would have kept down a shriek to the last, though they had roasted him alive. But now, when there were none to see or hear him, he fell upon his knees on the floor, and hiding his face in his hands, wept such tears as God send for the credit of our nature, few so young may ever have cause to pour out before him. For a long time Oliver remained motionless in this attitude. The candle was burning low in the socket when he rose to his feet. Having gazed cautiously round him and listened intently, he gently undid the fastenings of the door and looked abroad. It was a cold, dark night. The stars seemed to the boy's eyes farther from the earth than he had ever seen them before. There was no wind, and the sombre shadows thrown by the trees upon the ground looked sepulchral and death-like from being so still. He softly reclosed the door. Having availed himself of the expiring light of the candle to tie up in a handkerchief the few articles of wearing apparel he had, he sat himself down upon a bench to wait for morning. With the first ray of light that struggled through the crevices in the shutters, Oliver arose and again unbarred the door. One timid look around, one moment's pause of hesitation. He had closed it behind him, and was in the open street. He looked to the right and to the left, uncertain whither to fly. He remembered to have seen the wagons as they went out, toiling up the hill. He took the same route, and arriving at a footpath across the fields, which he knew after some distance led out again onto the road, struck into it, and walked quickly on. Early on the 7th morning, after he had left his native place, Oliver limped slowly into the little town of Barnet. The window shutters were closed, the street was empty, not a soul had awakened to the business of the day. The sun was rising in all its splendid beauty, but the light only served to show the boy his own loneliness and desolation as he sat with bleeding feet and covered with dust upon a cold doorstep. He had been crouching on the step for some time, when he was roused by observing that a boy, who had passed him carelessly some minutes before, had returned, and was now surveying him most earnestly from the opposite side of the way. He took little heed of this at first, but the boy remained in the same attitude of close observation so long that Oliver raised his head and returned his steady look. Upon this the boy crossed over, and walking close up to Oliver, said,
"Hello, my covey. What's the row?"
The boy, who addressed this inquiry to the young wayfarer, was about his own age, but one of the queerest-looking boys that Oliver had ever seen. He was a snub-nosed, flat-browed, common-faced boy enough, and as dirty a juvenile as one would wish to see, but he had about him all the airs and manners of a man. He was short of his age, with rather bow legs, and little, sharp, ugly eyes. His hat was stuck on the top of his head so lightly that it threatened to fall off every moment, and would have done so very often if the wearer had not had a knack of, every now and then, giving his head a sudden twitch, which brought it back to its old place again. He wore a man's coat which reached nearly to his heels. He had turned the cuffs back halfway up his arm to get his hands out of his sleeves, apparently with the ultimate view of thrusting them into the pockets of his corduroy trousers, for there he kept them. He was altogether as roistering and swaggering a young gentleman as ever stood 4 feet 6, or something less, in his bluchers.
"Hello, my covey. What's the row?"
said this strange young gentleman to Oliver.
"I am very hungry and tired,"
replied Oliver, the tears standing in his eyes as he spoke.
"I have walked a long way. I have been walking these 7 days." "Going to London?"
said the strange boy.
"Yes."
"Got any lodgings?"
"No."
"Money?"
"No."
The strange boy whistled, and put his arms into his pockets as far as the big coat sleeves would let them go.
"What's your name, sir?"
"Jack Dawkins, my name, though some there is calls me the Artful Dodger."
"Do you live in London?"
inquired Oliver.
"Yeah, I do when I'm at home. I suppose you want some place to sleep in tonight, don't you?"
"I do indeed," answered Oliver. "I have not slept under a roof since I left the country."
"Don't fret your eyelids on that score,"
said the young gentleman.
"I've got to be in London tonight, and I know a respectable old gentleman as lives there what'll give you lodgings for nothing, and never ask for the change."
This unexpected offer of a shelter was too tempting to be resisted, especially as it was immediately followed up by the assurance that the old gentleman referred to would doubtless provide Oliver with a comfortable place without loss of time. As Jack Dawkins objected to their entering London before nightfall, it was nearly 11 o'clock when Oliver's conductor, catching him by the arm, pushed open the door of a house near Field Lane. The walls and ceiling of the room they entered were perfectly black with age and dirt. There was a deal table before the fire, upon which were a candle stuck in a ginger beer bottle, 2 or 3 pewter pots, a loaf and butter, and a plate. In a frying pan, which was on the fire, and which was secured to the mantel-shelf by a string, some sausages were cooking, and, standing over them, with a toasting fork in his hand, was a very old, shrivelled gentleman, whose villainous-looking and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. Seated round the table were 4 or 5 boys, none older than the Dodger, smoking long clay pipes and drinking spirits with the air of middle-aged men. These all crowded about their associate as he whispered a few words to the old man, and then turned round and grinned at Oliver. So did the old gentleman himself, toasting fork in hand.
"This is him, Fagin,"
said Jack Dawkins.
"My friend Oliver Twist."
"We are very glad to see you, Oliver. Very," said Fagin. "Dodger, take off the sausages, and draw a tub near the fire for Oliver." Oliver ate his share, and Fagin then mixed him a glass of hot gin and water, telling him he must drink it off directly. Oliver did as he was desired. Immediately afterwards he felt himself gently lifted onto one of the sacks, and then he sank into a deep sleep. It was late next morning when Oliver awoke from a sound, long sleep. There was no other person in the room but the old man, who was boiling some coffee in a saucepan. Oliver saw him with his half-closed eyes, heard his low whistling, and recognized the sound of the spoon grating against the saucepan's sides. When the coffee was done, Fagin drew the saucepan to the hob. He turned round and looked at Oliver, and called him by his name. He did not answer, and was to all appearance asleep. After satisfying himself upon this, Fagin then drew forth, as it seemed to Oliver from some trap in the floor, a small box, which he placed carefully on the table. His eyes glistened as he raised the lid, and took from it a magnificent gold watch, sparkling with jewels. At least half a dozen more were severally drawn forth from the same box, and surveyed with equal pleasure, besides rings, brooches, bracelets, and other articles of jewellery of such magnificent materials and costly workmanship that Oliver had no idea even of their names. Having replaced these trinkets, Fagin took out another, so small that it lay in the palm of his hand. There seemed to be some very minute inscription on it, for he laid it flat upon the table, and, shading it with his hand, pored over it long and earnestly. At length he put it down, and his bright dark eyes, which had been staring vacantly before him, fell on Oliver's face. The boy's eyes were fixed on his in mute curiosity, and although the recognition was only for an instant, it was enough to show the old man that he had been observed. He closed the lid of the box with a loud crash, and laying his hand on a bread knife which was on the table, started furiously up. He trembled very much, though, for even in his terror Oliver could see that the knife quivered in the air. "What's that? What do you watch me for? Why are you awake? What have you seen? Speak out, boy! Quick, quick, for your life!"
"I wasn't able to sleep any longer, sir," replied Oliver meekly. "I'm very sorry if I've disturbed you, sir."
"You were not awake an hour ago?"
No, indeed," replied Oliver.
"Are you sure?" cried Fagin, with a still fiercer look than before, and a threatening attitude.
"Upon my word, I was not, sir," replied Oliver earnestly. "I was not, indeed, sir."
"Tush, tush, my dear," said Fagin, abruptly resuming his old manner, and playing with the knife a little before he laid it down, as if to induce the belief that he had caught it up in mere sport. "Of course, I know that, my dear. I only try to frighten you, eh? You're a brave boy, Oliver." At this moment the Dodger returned, accompanied by a very sprightly young friend whom Oliver had seen smoking on the previous night, and who was now formally introduced to him as Charlie Bates. "Well," said Fagin, "I hope you've been at work this morning, my dears." "Hard," replied the Dodger. "As nails," added Charlie Bates. Good boys, good boys. What have you got, Dodger?" "Couple of pocket-books," replied the young gentleman. "Lined?" "Pretty well," replied the Dodger, producing 2 pocket-books, one green and the other red. "Not so heavy as they might be," said Fagin, after looking at the insides carefully, "but very neat and nicely made. Ingenious workman, ain't he, Oliver?" "Oh, very, indeed, sir," said Oliver, at which Mr. Charles Bates laughed uproariously, very much to the amazement of Oliver, who saw nothing to laugh at in anything that had passed. When the breakfast was cleared away, the merry old gentleman and the 2 boys played at a very curious and uncommon game. The merry old gentleman, placing a snuff-box in one pocket of his trousers, a note-case in the other, and a watch in his waistcoat pocket, with a guard chain round his neck, and sticking a mock diamond pin in his shirt, buttoned his coat tight round him, and, putting his spectacle case and handkerchief in his pockets, trotted up and down the room with a stick, in imitation of the manner in which old gentlemen walk about the streets any hour of the day. All this time the two boys followed him closely about, getting out of his sight so nimbly every time he turned round it was impossible to follow their motions. At last the Dodger trod upon his toes, while Charlie Bates stumbled up against him behind, and in that one moment they took from him with the most extraordinary rapidity snuff-box, note-case, watch-guard, chain, shirt-pin, pocket-handkerchief. When this game had been played a great many times, a couple of young ladies called in to see the young gentleman, one of whom was named Bet, and the other Nancy. Being remarkably free and agreeable in their manners, Oliver thought them very nice girls indeed. These visitors stopped a long time. Spirits were produced in consequence of one of the young ladies complaining of a coldness in her inside, and the conversation took a very convivial and improving turn. At length the Dodger and Charlie and the two young ladies went away together, having been kindly furnished by the amiable old gentleman with money to spend. "There, my dear," said Fagin. "That's a pleasant life, isn't it? I've gone out for the day. Now, is my handkerchief hanging out of my pocket, my dear?" "Yes, sir," said Oliver. "See if you can take it out without my feeling it, as you saw them do when we were at play this morning." Oliver held up the bottom of the pocket with one hand, as he had seen the Dodger hold it, and drew the handkerchief lightly out of it with the other. "Is it, gone?" cried Fagin. "Here it is, sir," said Oliver, showing it in his hand. "You're a clever boy, my dear," said the playful old gentleman, patting Oliver on the head approvingly. "I never saw a sharper lad. Here's a shilling for you. If you go on in this way, you will be the greatest man of all time." For many days Oliver remained in Fagin's room, picking the marks out of the pocket-handkerchiefs, of which a great number were brought home, and sometimes taking part in the game already described. At length, one morning, Oliver obtained the permission he had so eagerly sought to go out to work with his two companions. The three boys sallied out, the Dodger with his coat sleeves tucked up and his hat cocked as usual. The pace at which they went was such a very lazy, ill-looking saunter that Oliver soon began to think his companions were going to deceive the old gentleman by not going to work at all. Then the Dodger made a sudden stop. "What's the matter?" demanded Oliver. "Hush!" replied the Dodger. "Do you see that old cove at the bookstall?" "The old gentleman over the way," said Oliver. "Yes, I see him." "He'll do," said the Dodger. "A prime plant," observed Master Charlie Bates. Oliver looked from one to the other with the greatest surprise, but he was not permitted to make any inquiries, for the two boys walked stealthily across the road and slunk close behind the old gentleman. What was Oliver's horror and alarm to see the Dodger plunge his hand into the old gentleman's pocket, and draw from thence a handkerchief, to see him hand the same to Charlie Bates, and finally to behold them both running away round the corner at full speed. In an instant the whole mystery of the handkerchiefs and the watches and the jewels and Fagin rushed upon the boy's mind. He stood for a moment with the blood so tingling through all his veins from terror that he felt as if he were burning in a fire. Then, confused and frightened, he took to his heels, and not knowing what he did, made off as fast as he could lay his feet to the ground. This was all done in a minute's space, and the very instant that Oliver began to run, the old gentleman, putting his hand to his pocket and missing his handkerchief, turned sharp round. Seeing the boy scudding away at such a rapid pace, he very naturally concluded him to be the depredator, and shouting, "Stop, thief!" with all his might, made off after him, book in hand. But the old gentleman was not the only person who raised the hue and cry. The Dodger and Master Bates, unwilling to attract public attention by running down the open street, had merely retired into the very first doorway round the corner. They no sooner heard the cry and saw Oliver running than, guessing exactly how the matter stood, they issued forth with great promptitude, and shouting, "Stop, thief!" too, joined in the pursuit like good citizens. Stopped at last! A clever blow! He is down upon the pavement, and the crowd eagerly gather round him, each newcomer jostling and struggling with the others to catch a glimpse. "Stand aside! Give him a little ear!" "Nonsense, he don't deserve it!" "Where's the gentleman?" "Here he is, coming down the street." "Make room there for the gentleman." "Is this the boy, sir?" "Yes," said the gentleman. "I'm afraid it is the boy." "Afraid?" murmured the crowd. "That's a good 'un." "Poor fellow," said the gentleman. "He has hurt himself." A police officer at that moment made his way through the crowd and seized Oliver by the collar. "Don't hurt him," said the old gentleman compassionately. "Oh, no, I won't hurt him," replied the officer, tearing his jacket half off his back in proof thereof. "Come, I know you. It won't do. Will you stand upon your legs, you young devil?" Oliver, who could hardly stand, made a shift to raise himself on his feet, and was at once lugged along the streets by the jacket collar at a rapid pace. The crowd had only the satisfaction of accompanying Oliver through 2 or 3 streets and down a place called Mutton Hill, when he was led beneath a low archway and up a dirty court. It was a small paved yard, into which they turned, and here they encountered a stout man with a bunch of whiskers on his face and a bunch of keys in his hand. "What's the matter now?" said the man carelessly. "A young fogle hunter," replied the man who had Oliver in charge. "Are you the party that's been robbed, sir?" inquired the man with the keys. "Yes, I am," replied the old gentleman, "but I'm not sure that this boy actually took the handkerchief. I would rather not press the case." "Must go before the magistrate now, sir," replied the man. "Now, young gallows." This was an invitation for Oliver to enter through a door, which he unlocked as he spoke, and which led into a stone cell. Here he was searched, and nothing being found upon him, locked up. "There is something in that boy's face," said the old gentleman to himself, as he walked slowly away, tapping his chin with the cover of the book in a thoughtful manner. "Something that touches and interests me. Can he be innocent? He looked like—" "By the by," exclaimed the old gentleman, halting very abruptly and staring up into the sky. "God bless my soul! Where have I seen something like that look before?" But the old gentleman could recall no one countenance of which Oliver's features bore a trace. He was roused by a touch on the shoulder and a request from the man with the keys to follow him into the office, and was at once ushered into the imposing presence of the renowned Mr. Fang. "Who are you?" cried Mr. Fang. The old gentleman pointed with some surprise to his card. "Officer," said Mr. Fang, tossing the card contemptuously away, "who is this fellow?" "My name, sir," said the old gentleman, speaking like a gentleman, "my name, sir, is Brownlow. Permit me to inquire the name of the magistrate who offers a gratuitous and unprovoked insult to a respectable person under the protection of the bench."
"Officer, what's this fellow charged with?"
"He's not charged at all, your worship," replied the officer. "He appears against the boy, your worship." His worship knew this perfectly well, but it was a good annoyance and a safe one.
"Appears against the boy, does he?"
said Fang, surveying Mr. Brownlow contemptuously from head to foot.
"Swear him."
"Before I am sworn, I must beg to say one word," said Mr. Brownlow, "and that is that I have really never, without actual experience, I could never—"
"Hold your tongue, sir."
"I will not, sir."
"Hold your tongue this instant, or I'll have you turned out of the office,"
said Mr. Fang.
"You're an insolent, impertinent fellow. How dare you bully a magistrate?"
"What?" exclaimed the old gentleman, reddening.
"Now, what's the charge against this boy? What have you got to say, sir?"
"I was standing at a bookstall—"
"Hold your tongue, sir! Policeman! Where's the policeman? Here, swear this policeman. Now, policeman, what is this?"
The policeman, with becoming humility, related how he had taken charge, how he had searched Oliver and found nothing on his person, and how that was all he knew about it. Then, with many interruptions and repeated insults, Mr. Brownlow contrived to state his case, observing that in the surprise of the moment he had run after the boy because he saw him running away, and expressing his hope that, if the magistrate should believe him, though not actually the thief, to be connected with thieves, he would deal as leniently with him as justice would allow. "And he had been hurt already," said the old gentleman in conclusion, "and I fear," he added with great energy, looking towards the bar, "I really fear that he is very ill."
"Oh, yes, I dare say," said Mr. Fang with a sneer. "Come, none of your tricks here, you young vagabond. They won't do. What's your name?"
Oliver tried to reply, but his tongue failed him. He was deadly pale, and the whole place seemed to be turning round and round.
"I really think he is ill, your worship," remonstrated the officer.
"I know better," said Mr. Fang.
"Take care of him, officer." "Officer," said the old gentleman, raising his hands instinctively. "He'll fall down."
"Stand away, officer," cried Fang savagely. "Let him, if he likes."
Oliver availed himself of the kind permission and fell to the floor in a fainting fit. The men in the office looked at each other, but no one dared stir.
"I knew he was shamming," said Fang, as if this were incontestable proof of the fact. "Let him lie there. He'll soon be tired of that."
"How do you propose to deal with the case, sir?"
inquired the clerk in a low voice.
"Summarily," replied Fang. "He stands committed for 3 months. Hard labour, of course. Clear the office."
The door was open for this purpose, and a couple of men were preparing to carry the insensible boy to his cell, when an elderly man, of decent but poor appearance, clad in an old suit of black, rushed hastily into the office and advanced towards the bench.
"Stop, stop! Don't take him away, for heaven's sake! Stop a moment!"
cried the newcomer, breathless with haste.
"What is this? Who is this? Turn this man out! Clear the office!"
cried Mr. Fang.
"I will speak," cried the man. "I will not be turned out. I saw it all. I keep the bookstall. I demand to be sworn. I will not be put down." "Swear the man," growled Mr. Fang with a very ill grace. "Now, man, what have you got to say?"
"This," said the man. "I saw 3 boys, 2 others and the prisoner here, loitering on the opposite side of the way when this gentleman was reading. The robbery was committed by another boy. I saw it done, and I saw that this boy was perfectly amazed and stupefied by it."
"The prosecutor was reading, was he?"
inquired Fang after a pause. "Yes," replied the man. "The very book he has in his hand."
"Oh, that book, eh? Is it paid for?"
"No, it is not," replied the man with a smile. "Dear me, I forgot all about it," exclaimed the absent-minded old gentleman innocently.
"A nice person to prefer a charge against a poor boy," said Fang, with a comical effort to look humane. "I consider, sir, that you have obtained possession of that book under very suspicious and disreputable circumstances, and you may think yourself very fortunate that the owner of the property declines to prosecute. Let this be a lesson to you, my man, or the law will overtake you yet. The boy is discharged. Clear the office."
"Damn me!" cried the old gentleman, bursting up with the rage he had kept down so long. "Damn me, I'll
Clear the office! Officers, do you hear? Clear the office!"
The mandate was obeyed, and the indignant Mr. Brownlow was conveyed out in a perfect frenzy of rage and defiance. He reached the yard, and his passion vanished in a moment. Little Oliver Twist lay on his back on the pavement, with his shirt unbuttoned, and his temples bathed with water, his face a deadly white, and a cold tremble convulsing his whole frame. "Poor boy, said Mr. Brownlow, bending over him. "Call a coach, somebody, pray, directly." A coach was obtained, and Oliver having been carefully laid in one seat, the old gentleman got in and sat himself on the other. "May I accompany you?" said the bookstall keeper, looking in. "Bless me, yes, my dear sir," said Mr. Brownlow quickly. "I forgot you. Dear, I have this unhappy book still. Jump in." "Poor fellow, there's no time to lose." The bookstall keeper got into the coach, and away they drove. For many days, Oliver remained insensible to all the goodness of his new friends. Weak and thin and pallid, he awoke at last and looked anxiously around. "What room is this? Where have I been brought to?" said Oliver. "This is not the place I went to sleep in. The curtain at the bed's head was hastily drawn back, and a motherly old lady, very neatly and precisely dressed, rose from an armchair close by. "Hush, my dear," said the old lady softly. "You must be very quiet, or you will be ill again. And you have been very bad as bad could be, pretty nigh. Lie down again, there's a dear." Gradually he fell into that deep, tranquil sleep which ease from recent suffering alone imparts, that calm and peaceful rest which it is pain to wake from. Who, if this were death, would be roused again to all the struggles and turmoils of life, to all its cares for the present, its anxieties for the future, more than all its weary recollections of the past? It had been a bright day for hours when Oliver opened his eyes. He felt cheerful and happy. The crisis of the disease was safely past. He belonged to the world again. In 3 days' time he was able to sit in an easy chair, well propped up with pillows, and as he was still too weak to walk, the old lady, Mrs. Bedwin, had him carried downstairs into the little housekeeper's room, which belonged to her. Having him set here by the fireside, the good old lady sat herself down too. "Are you fond of pictures, dear?" inquired the old lady, seeing that Oliver had fixed his eyes most intently on a portrait which hung against the wall just opposite his chair. "I don't quite know, ma'am," said Oliver, without taking his eyes from the canvas. "I have seen so few that I hardly know. What a beautiful, mild face that lady's is." Now the old gentleman came in as brisk as need be, but he had no sooner raised his spectacles on his forehead and thrust his hands behind the skirts of his dressing-gown to take a good, long look at Oliver, than his countenance underwent a very great variety of odd contortions. "Gracious God, what's this? Bedwin, look! Look there!" As he spoke, he pointed hastily to the picture above Oliver's head, and then to the boy's face. There was its living copy. The eyes, the head, the mouth, every feature was the same. The expression was, for an instant, so precisely alike that the minutest line seemed copied with an accuracy which was perfectly unearthly. Oliver knew what was the cause of this sudden exclamation, but he was not strong enough to bear the start it gave him, and he fainted away. When the Dodger and his accomplished friend, Master Bates, returned after Oliver's capture, the noise of the footsteps on the creaking stairs roused the merry old gentleman as he sat over the fire with a saveloy and a small loaf in his left hand. The door was slowly opened, and the Dodger and Charlie Bates entered, closing it behind them. "Where's Oliver?"
"Where's Oliver, you young hounds? What's become of the boy?" said Fagin, seizing the Dodger tightly by the collar. "Why, the traps have got him, and that's all about it. Come, let go of me, will you?" And swinging himself at one jerk clean out of the big coat, which he left in Fagin's hands, the Dodger snatched up the toasting fork and made a pass at the merry old gentleman's waistcoat, which, if it had taken effect, would have let a little more merriment out than could have been easily replaced. Fagin stepped back in this emergency with more agility than could have been anticipated in a man of his apparent decrepitude, and seizing up a pewter pot, prepared to hurl it at his assailant's head. But Charlie Bates, at this moment calling his attention by a perfectly terrific howl, he suddenly altered its destination and flung it full at that young gentleman. "Why, what the blazes is in the wind there?" growled a deep voice. "Who pitched that here at me? It's when it's the beer and not the pot as hit me, or I'll sow somebody."
The man who growled out these words was a stoutly built fellow of about 35. He had a brown hat on his head and a dirty belcher handkerchief round his neck, with long frayed ends, of which he smeared the beer from his face as he spoke. He disclosed, when he had done so, a broad, heavy countenance with a beard of 3 days' growth and 2 scowling eyes, one of which displayed various party-coloured symptoms of having been recently damaged by a blow.
"What are you up to? You treating the boys, you covetous, avaricious, insatiable old fence?"
said the man, seating himself deliberately. "Hush, hush, Mr. Sykes, don't speak so loud.
None of your mistering. You always mean mischief when you come to that. You know my name. Out with it. I shan't disgrace it when the time comes.
Well then, Bill Sykes. You seem out of humour, Bill. After swallowing 2 or 3 glasses of spirits, Mr. Sykes condescended to take some notice of the young gentleman, which gracious act led to a conversation, in which the cause and manner of Oliver's capture were circumstantially detailed, with such alterations and improvements on the truth as to the Dodger appeared most advisable under the circumstances. "I'm afraid," said Fagin, "that he may say something which will get us into trouble."
"That's very likely," returned Sykes with a malicious grin. "You're blowed upon, Fagin."
"We must know where he is, my dears. He must be found. Charlie, do nothing but skulk about till you bring home some news of him. Nancy, my dear, I must have him found. I trust to you, my dear, to you and the artful for everything." With these words he pushed them from the room, and carefully double-locking the door and barring it behind them, drew from its place of concealment the box, which he had unintentionally disclosed to Oliver, and hastily proceeded to dispose the watches and jewellery beneath his clothing. A rap at the door startled him in this occupation. "Who's there?" he cried in a shrill tone. "Me," replied the voice of the Dodger through the keyhole. "What now?" "Is he to be kidnapped to the other ken, Nancy says?" inquired the Dodger. "Yes. Wherever she lays hands on him, find him out, that's all. I shall know what to do next, never fear." The boy murmured a reply of intelligence, and hurried downstairs after his companions. "He has not peached so far," said Fagin, as he pursued his occupation. "If he means to blab us among his new friends, we may stop his windpipe yet." They were happy days, those of Oliver's recovery. Everything was so quiet and neat and orderly, everybody was kind and gentle, that after the noise and turbulence in the midst of which he had always lived, it seemed like heaven itself. One evening, as he was sitting talking to Mrs. Bedwin, there came a message down from Mr. Brownlow that if Oliver Twist felt pretty well, he should like to see him in his study and talk to him a little while. Oliver tapped at the study door. On Mr. Brownlow calling to him to come in, he found himself in a little back room quite full of books, with a window looking into some pleasant little gardens. "Oliver," said Mr. Brownlow, speaking, if possible, in a kinder, but at the same time in a much more serious manner than Oliver had ever known him assume yet, "I want you to pay great attention, my boy, to what I am going to say. I shall talk to you without any reserve, because I am sure you are as well able to understand me as many older persons would be." "Oh, don't tell me you're going to send me away, sir, pray!" exclaimed Oliver, alarmed at the serious tone of the old gentleman's commencement. "Have mercy on a poor boy, sir." "My dear child," said the old gentleman, moved by the warmth of Oliver's sudden appeal, "you need not be afraid of my deserting you, unless you give me cause." "I never will, sir." Well. You say you are an orphan, without a friend in the world. All the inquiries I have been able to make confirm the statement. Let me hear your story. Where you come from, who brought you up, how you got into the company in which I found you. Speak the truth, and you shall not be friendless while I live." Oliver was on the point of beginning to relate how he had been brought up at the farm and carried to the workhouse by Mr. Bumble, when a servant running upstairs announced Mr. Grimwig. "Is he coming up?" inquired Mr. Brownlow. "Yes, sir," replied the servant. "He asked if there were any muffins in the house, and when I told him yes, he said he had come to tea." Mr. Brownlow smiled, and turning to Oliver, said that Mr. Grimwig was an old friend of his, and he must not mind his being a little rough with his manners, for he was a worthy creature at bottom, as he had reason to know. "Shall I go downstairs, sir?" "No, I would rather you remained here." At this moment there walked into the room, supporting himself by a thick stick, a stout old gentleman, rather lame in one leg, who was dressed in a blue coat, striped waistcoat, nankeen breeches and gaiters, and a broad-brimmed white hat with the sides turned up with green.
"Hello, what's that?"
cried Mr. Grimwig, looking at Oliver, and retreating a pace or two. "This is young Oliver Twist, whom we were speaking about," said Mr. Brownlow.
"Ah, that's the boy, is it?"
said Grimwig at length. "That is the boy."
"Ah, how are you, boy?"
"A great deal better, thank you, sir." Mr. Brownlow, seeming to apprehend that his singular friend was about to say something disagreeable, asked Oliver to step downstairs and tell Mrs. Bedwin they were ready for tea, which, as he did not half like the visitor's manner, he was very happy to do. "He is a nice-looking boy, is he not?" inquired Mr. Brownlow.
"I don't know,"
replied Mr. Grimwig pettishly. "Don't know?"
"No, I don't know. I never see any difference in boys. I only know two sorts of boys, mealy boys and beef-faced boys."
"And which is Oliver?"
"Mealy. I know a friend who has a beef-faced boy. A fine boy, they call him, with a round head and red cheeks and glaring eyes. Horrid boy, with a body and limbs that appear to be swelling out of the seams of his blue clothes, with the voice of a pilot and the appetite of a wolf. I know him, the wretch."
"Come," said Mr. Brownlow, "these are not the characteristics of young Oliver Twist, so he needn't excite your wrath." As Mr. Grimwig, at tea, was graciously pleased to express his entire approval of the muffins, matters went on very smoothly, and Oliver, who made one of the party, began to feel more at his ease than he had yet done in this fierce old gentleman's presence.
"And when are you going to hear a full, true, and particular account of the life and adventures of Oliver Twist?"
asked Grimwig of Mr. Brownlow. "Tomorrow morning," replied Mr. Brownlow. "I would rather he was alone with me at the time. Come up to me tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, my dear." "Yes, sir," replied Oliver.
"I'll tell you what," whispered that gentleman to Mr. Brownlow. "He won't come up to you tomorrow morning. He is deceiving you, my good friend."
"I'll swear he is not," replied Mr. Brownlow warmly. "We shall see," he added, checking his rising anger.
"We will,"
replied Mr. Grimwig with a provoking smile.
"We will."
As fate would have it, Mrs. Bedwin chanced to bring in at this moment a small parcel of books which Mr. Brownlow had that morning purchased of the identical bookstall keeper who has already figured in this history. Having laid them on the table, she prepared to leave the room. "Oh, stop the boy, Mrs. Bedwin," said Mr. Brownlow. "There is something to go back." "He has gone, sir," replied Mrs. Bedwin. "Dear me, I am very sorry for that," exclaimed Mr. Brownlow. "I particularly wish those books to be returned tonight."
"Send Oliver with them,"
said Mr. Grimwig with an ironical smile.
"He will be sure to deliver them safely, you know."
"Yes, do let me take them, if you please, sir. I'll run all the way, sir."
"You shall go, my dear," said Mr. Brownlow, glancing steadily at Grimwig. "You are to say that you have brought these books back, and that you have come to pay the £4.10 I owe him. This is a £5 note, so you will have to bring me back 10 shillings change."
"I won't be 10 minutes, sir,"
replied Oliver eagerly. Having buttoned up the banknote in his jacket pocket and placed the books carefully under his arm, he made a respectful bow and left the room. "Now let me see. He'll be back in 20 minutes at the longest," said Mr. Brownlow, pulling out his watch and placing it on the table. "It will be dark by then."
"Ah, you really expect him to come back, do you?"
inquired Mr. Grimwig. "Don't you?" asked Mr. Brownlow, smiling. The spirit of contradiction was strong in Mr. Grimwig's breast at the moment, and it was rendered stronger by his friend's confident smile.
"No," he said, smiting the table with his fist. "I do not. The boy has a new suit of clothes on his back, a set of valuable books under his arm, and a £5 note in his pocket. He'll join his old friends the thieves and laugh at you. If ever that boy returns to this house, sir, I'll eat my head."
With these words he drew his chair closer to the table, and there the two friends sat in silent expectation. It grew so dark that the figures on the dial plate were scarcely discernible, but there the two old gentlemen continued to sit in silence, with the watch between them. Oliver was walking along on his way to the bookshop, thinking how happy and contented he ought to feel, when he was startled by a young woman screaming out very loud, "Oh, my dear brother, and he'd hardly looked up to see what the matter was when he was stopped by having a pair of arms thrown tight round his neck. "Don't!" cried Oliver, struggling. "Let me go. Who is it? What are you stopping me for?"
"Oh, my gracious! I found him! Oh, Oliver, you naughty boy, make me suffer such distress on your account. Come home, dear. Come. Oh, I found him. Thank gracious goodness heavens, I found him. Come home directly, you cruel boy, come." "What's the matter, Mum?" inquired a woman who was looking on. "Oh, Ma'am, he ran away near a month ago from his parents, who are hard-working and respectable people, and he went and joined a set of thieves and bad characters, and almost broke his mother's heart."
"Young wretch," said the woman. "I am not," replied Oliver, greatly alarmed. "I don't know her. I haven't any sister or father or mother either. I'm an orphan. I live at Pentonville."
"Oh, hear him how he braves it out," cried the young woman.
"Why, it's Nancy!" exclaimed Oliver, who now saw her face for the first time, and started back in irrepressible astonishment.
"You see, he knows me," cried
Nancy. "What the devil's this?" said Bill Sikes, bursting out of a beer shop with a white dog at his heels. "Young Oliver, come home to your poor mother, you young dog. Come home directly." "I don't belong to them. I don't know them. Help! Help!" cried Oliver, struggling in the man's powerful grasp. In another moment he was dragged into a labyrinth of dark, narrow courts, and was forced along them at a pace which rendered the few cries he dared to give utterance to unintelligible. It was of little moment, indeed, whether they were intelligible or no, for there was nobody to care for them had they been ever so plain. The gas lamps were lighted. Mrs. Bedwin was waiting anxiously at the open door. The servant had run up the street 20 times to see if there were any traces of Oliver. And still the two old gentlemen sat, perseveringly, in the dark parlour, with the watch between them. The house to which Oliver had been conveyed was in the neighbourhood of Whitechapel. There the boy was lying fast asleep on a rude bed upon the floor, so pale with anxiety and sadness, and the closeness of his prison, that he looked like death. Not death as it shows in shroud and coffin, but in the guise it wears when life has just departed, when a young and gentle spirit has but an instant fled to heaven, and the gross air of the world has not had time to breathe upon the changing dust it hallowed. When Oliver awoke in the morning, he was a good deal surprised to find that a new pair of shoes with strong, thick soles had been placed at his bedside, and that his old shoes had been removed. At first he was pleased with the discovery, hoping that it might be the forerunner of his release, but such thoughts were quickly dispelled on his sitting down to breakfast along with Fagin, who told him, in a tone and manner which increased his alarm, that he was to be taken to the residence of Bill Sikes that night. Fagin seemed much vexed by Oliver's not expressing any curiosity on the subject, but the truth is that although Oliver felt very anxious, he was too much confused by the earnest cunning of Fagin's looks and his own speculations to make any further inquiries just then. He had no other opportunity, for the old man remained very surly and silent till night, when he prepared to go abroad. "You may burn a candle," said Fagin, putting one on the table, "and here's a book for you to read, till they come to fetch you. Good night." Oliver remained lost in thought for some minutes, and then, taking up the book, began to read. It was the history of the lives and trials of great criminals, and the pages were soiled and thumbed with use. Here he read of dreadful crimes that made the blood run cold. The terrible descriptions were so real and vivid that the sallow pages seemed to turn red with gore. In a paroxysm of fear, the boy closed the book and thrust it from him. Then a rustling noise aroused him. "What's that?" he cried, starting up and catching sight of a figure standing by the door. "Who's there?"
"Me. Only me,"
replied a tremulous voice. Oliver raised the candle above his head and looked towards the door. It was Nancy.
"Am I to go with you?"
asked Oliver.
"Yeah. I've come from Bill,"
replied the girl.
"You are to go with me."
"What for?" asked Oliver, recoiling.
"Hush,"
said the girl, stooping over him and pointing to the door as she looked cautiously round.
"You can't help yourself. I've tried hard for you, but all to no purpose. You are hedged round and round. If ever you are to get loose from here, this is not the time. Give me your hand. Make haste. Your hand."
She caught the hand which Oliver instinctively placed in hers, and, blowing out the light, drew him after her up the stairs. The door was opened quickly by someone shrouded in the darkness, and was as quickly closed when they had passed out. A hackney cabriolet was in waiting. The driver wanted no directions, but lashed his horse into full speed without the delay of an instant. All was so quick and hurried that Oliver had scarcely time to recollect where he was or how he came there, when the carriage stopped at its destination. For one brief moment, Oliver cast a hurried glance along the empty street, and a cry for help hung upon his lips. But the girl's voice was in his ear, beseeching him in such tones of agony to remember her, that he had not the heart to utter it. While he hesitated, the opportunity was gone. He was already in the house, and the door was shut.
"This way,"
said the girl, releasing her hold for the first time.
"Bill?"
"So you got the kid?" said Sikes, when they had all reached the room, closing the door as he spoke.
"Yes, here he is," replied Nancy.
Did he come quiet?
inquired Sikes.
"Like a lamb,"
rejoined Nancy.
I'm glad to hear it,
said Sikes, looking grimly at Oliver.
for the sake of his young carcass, as would otherwise have suffered for it. And now let's have some supper and get a snooze before starting."
For a long time Oliver lay awake, thinking it not impossible that Nancy might seek that opportunity of whispering some further advice. But the girl sat brooding over the fire, without moving, save now and then to trim the light. Weary with watching and anxiety, he at length fell asleep. When he awoke, the table was covered with tea things, and Sikes was thrusting various articles into the pockets of his greatcoat, which hung over the back of the chair.
"Now then,"
growled Sikes as Oliver started up.
5:30. Look sharp, or you'll get no breakfast, for it's late as it is."
Nancy, scarcely looking at the boy, threw him a handkerchief to tie round his throat. Sikes gave him a large, rough cape to button over his shoulders. Thus attired, he gave his hand to the robber, who, merely pausing to show him with a menacing gesture that he had a pistol in the side pocket of his greatcoat, clasped it firmly in his, and exchanging a farewell with Nancy, led him away. It was a cheerless morning when they got into the street, blowing and raining hard, and the clouds looking dull and stormy. They passed Hyde Park Corner, and were on their way to Kensington when Sikes relaxed his pace until an empty cart, which was at some little distance behind, came up. Seeing Hounslow written on it, he asked the driver, with as much civility as he could assume, if they would give them a lift as far as Isleworth.
"Jump up,"
said the man. "Is that your boy?"
"Yeah, he's my boy,"
replied Sikes, looking hard at Oliver, and putting his hand abstractedly into the pocket where the pistol was. At length they came to a public house called the Coach and Horses, and here the cart stopped. They had some cold beef for dinner, and sat so long after it, while Mr. Sikes indulged himself with 3 or 4 pipes, that Oliver, then quite overpowered by fatigue and the fumes of the tobacco, fell asleep. It was quite dark when he was awakened by a push from Sikes. Rousing himself sufficiently to sit up and look about him, he found that worthy in close fellowship and communication with the driver over a pint of ale.
"Oh, you're going to Lower Halliford, are you?"
inquired Sikes. "I'm your man as far as I'll go," replied the other. The horse, whose health had been drunk in his absence, was standing outside ready harnessed to the cart. Oliver and Sikes got in without any further ceremony. The night was very dark. A damp mist rose from the river and the marshy ground about, and spread itself over the dreary fields. Sunbury was passed through, and they came again into the lonely road. 2 or 3 miles more, the cart stopped. Sikes alighted, took Oliver by the hand, and they once again walked on. They turned into no house at Shepperton, as the weary boy had expected, but still kept walking on in mud and darkness, through gloomy lanes and over cold open wastes, until they stood before a solitary house, all ruinous and decayed. Sikes, with Oliver's hand still in his, softly approached the low porch and raised the latch. The door yielded to the pressure, and they passed in together. Sikes pushed Oliver before him, and they entered a low, dark room where a man was reposing at full length, smoking a long clay pipe.
"Bill, my boy!"
Uttering this exclamation in a tone of great surprise, as his eye rested on Oliver, Mr. Toby Crackit brought himself into a sitting posture and demanded who that was.
"The boy, only the boy,"
replied Sikes, drawing a chair towards the fire.
"Now, if you'll give us something to eat and drink while we're waiting, you'll put some heart in us, or in me at all events. Sit down by the fire, younker, and rest yourself. You'll have to go out with us again tonight, though not very far off."
It was intensely dark when they set off. The fog was much heavier than it had been in the early part of the night. After walking about a quarter of a mile, they stopped before a detached house surrounded by a wall, to the top of which Toby Crackit, scarcely pausing to take breath, climbed in a twinkling. And now, for the first time, Oliver, well-nigh mad with grief and terror, saw that housebreaking and robbery, if not murder, were the objects of the expedition.
"Now listen, you young limb,"
whispered Sikes, drawing a dark lantern from his pocket.
"I'm going to put you through that window. Take this light, go softly up the steps afore you, and along the little hall to the street door. Unfasten it, and let us in."
Sikes put Oliver gently through the window with his feet first, and without leaving hold of his collar, planted him safely on the floor inside. In the short time he had to collect his senses, the boy had firmly resolved that whether he died in the attempt or not, he would make one effort to dart up the stairs from the hall and alarm the family. Filled with this idea, he advanced at once, but stealthily.
"Come back!"
suddenly cried Sikes aloud.
"Back! Back!" Scared by the sudden breaking of the dead stillness of the place, and by the loud cry which followed it, Oliver let his lantern fall, and knew not whether to advance or fly. The cry was repeated. A light appeared. A vision of two terrified, half-dressed men at the top of the stairs swam before his eyes. A flash! A loud noise! A smoke! A crash somewhere! But where, he knew not, and he staggered back. Sikes had him by the collar before the smoke had cleared away, and drew him through the window. The noises grew confused in the distance, and a cold, deadly feeling crept over the boy's heart, and he saw or heard no more. "It's all up, Bill! Drop the kid and show him your heels!"
With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit darted off at full speed. Sikes clenched his teeth, took one look around, threw down the prostrate form of Oliver, and was gone.
Ho there!" cried a tremulous voice in the rear. "Pincher! Neptune! Come here! Come here!"
The dogs, who in common with their masters seemed to have no particular relish for the sport in which they were engaged, readily answered to the command. The three men, who had by this time advanced some distance into the field, stopped to take counsel together.
"My advice, or leastways I should say my orders, is, said the fattest man of the party, that we immediately go home again."
I am agreeable to anything which is agreeable to Mr. Giles,"
said the shorter man, who was by no means of a slim figure, and who was very pale in the face and very polite, as frightened men frequently are.
"I shouldn't wish to appear ill-mannered, gentlemen,"
said the third, who had called the dogs back.
"Mr. Giles ought to know."
This dialogue was held between the two men who had surprised the burglars and a travelling tinker, who had been sleeping in an outhouse, and who had been roused, together with his two mongrel curs, to join in the pursuit. Mr. Giles acted in the double capacity of butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion. Brittles was a lad of all work, who, having entered her service a mere child, was treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. They made the best of their way home at a good round trot, and long after their dusky forms had ceased to be discernible, the light might have been seen twinkling and dancing in the distance, like some exhalation of the damp and gloomy atmosphere through which it was swiftly borne. At length, a low cry of pain broke the stillness that prevailed, and uttering it, the boy awoke. He looked about and saw that At no great distance there was a house, which perhaps he could reach. He summoned up all his strength for one last trial, and bent his faltering steps towards it. It happened that about this time Mr. Giles, Brittles, and the tinker were recruiting themselves, after the fatigues and terrors of the night, with tea and sundries in the kitchen. Mr. Giles illustrated a circumstantial and minute account of the robbery, to which his hearers, but especially the cook and the housemaid who were of the party, listened with breathless interest. He had risen from his seat and taken 2 steps with his eyes shut to accompany his description with appropriate action, when he started violently, in common with the rest of the company, and hurried back to his chair. The cook and housemaid screamed. It was a knock," said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity. Yes, open the door. Somebody?" Brittles obeyed. The group, peeping timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes and mutely solicited their compassion.
"Here he is,"
bawled Giles, calling in a state of great excitement up the staircase.
"Here is one of the thieves, ma'am. Here is a thief, miss. Wounded, miss. I shot him, miss, and Brittles held the light."
In the midst of all this noise and commotion there was heard a sweet female voice which quelled it in an instant. "Giles," whispered the voice from the stairhead.
"I'm here, miss. Don't be frightened, miss. I ain't much injured. He didn't make a very desperate resistance, miss. I was, soon too many for him."
"Hush," replied the young lady. "You frightened my aunt as much as the thieves did. Poor fellow. Oh, treat him kindly, Giles, for my sake." The old servant looked up at the speaker as she turned away, with a glance as proud and admiring as if she had been his own child. Then, bending over Oliver, he helped to carry him upstairs with the care and solicitude of a woman. In a handsome room, though its furniture had rather the air of old-fashioned comfort than of modern elegance, there sat 2 ladies at a well-spread breakfast table. One was well advanced in years, but the high-backed oaken chair in which she sat was not more upright than she. The younger lady was in the lovely bloom and springtime of womanhood, at that age when, if ever angels be for God's good purposes enthroned in mortal forms, they may be, without impiety, supposed to abide in such as hers. A gig drove up to the garden gate. Out of it there jumped a fat gentleman who ran straight up to the door, and who, getting quickly into the house by some mysterious process, burst into the room and nearly overturned the breakfast table.
"Oh, I never heard of such a thing," exclaimed the doctor. My dear Mrs. Maylie, bless my soul, in the silence of night, too. Never heard of such a thing. You ought to be dead, positively dead with the fright. And you, Miss Rose," said the doctor, turning to the young lady.
Oh, very much so indeed," said Rose, interrupting him. "But there is a poor creature upstairs whom aunt wishes you to see." The doctor was absent much longer than either he or the ladies had anticipated. At length he returned, and in reply to an anxious inquiry after his patient, looked very mysterious, and closed the door carefully.
Very extraordinary thing, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, standing with his back to the door as if to keep it shut. "Have you any objection to see him in my presence?"
"If it be necessary," replied the old lady, "certainly not."
"Ah, well, then I think it is necessary," said the doctor.
Stepping before them, the doctor looked into the room. Motioning them to advance, he closed the door when they had entered, and gently drew back the curtains of the bed. Upon it, in lieu of the dogged, black-visaged ruffian they had expected to behold, there lay a mere child, worn with pain and exhaustion, and sunk into a deep sleep. "What can this mean?" exclaimed the elder lady. "This poor child can never have been the pupil of robbers. My days are drawing to their close, and may mercy be shown to me as I show it to others. What can I do to save him, sir?"
Yes, let me think, ma'am. Yes, let me think. If you give me a full and unlimited commission to bully Giles and that little boy, Brittles, I can manage it."
"Unless there is some other way of preserving the child," replied Mrs. Maylie.
"Oh, no other," said the doctor. "No other, take my word for it."
In short, a neighbouring magistrate was readily induced to take the joint bail of Mrs. Maylie and Mr. Losberne the doctor, for Oliver's appearance if he should ever be called upon. Meanwhile Oliver gradually throve and prospered under the united care of Mrs. Maylie and the kind-hearted Mr. Losberne. Oliver's ailings were neither slight nor few. In addition to the pain and delay attendant on a broken limb, his exposure to the wet and cold had brought on fever and ague, which hung about him for many weeks and reduced him sadly. "Poor fellow," said Rose, when Oliver had been one day feebly endeavouring to utter the words of thankfulness that rose to his pale lips. "You shall have many opportunities of serving us, if you will. We are going to the country, and my aunt intends that you shall accompany us. To think that my dear good aunt should have been the means of rescuing anyone from such sad misery would be an unspeakable pleasure to me, but to know that the object of her goodness and compassion was sincerely grateful and attached in consequence would delight me more than you can well imagine. Do you understand me?" she inquired, watching Oliver's thoughtful face. "Oh, yes, ma'am, yes," replied Oliver eagerly. "But I was thinking that I am ungrateful now." "To whom?" inquired the young lady. "To the kind gentleman and the dear old nurse who took so much care of me before. If they knew how happy I am, they would be pleased, I am sure." "I am sure they would, and Mr. Losberne has already been kind enough to promise that when you are well enough to bear the journey, he will carry you to see them." "Has he, ma'am?" cried Oliver, his face brightening with pleasure. "I don't know what I shall do for joy when I see their kind faces once again." In a short time Oliver was sufficiently recovered to undergo the fatigue of this expedition. One morning he and Mr. Losberne set out accordingly in a little carriage which belonged to Mrs. Maylie. As Oliver knew the name of the street in which Mr. Brownlow resided, they were enabled to drive straight thither. Alas, the house was empty, and there was a bill in the window, "To let."
Knock at the next door," cried Mr. Losberne, taking Oliver's arm in his. What has become of Mr. Brownlow, who used to live in the adjoining house? Do you know, huh?"
The servant did not know, but she would go and inquire. She presently returned and said that Mr. Brownlow had sold off his goods and gone to the West Indies 6 weeks before. Oliver clasped his hands and sank feebly backwards. This bitter disappointment caused Oliver much sorrow and grief, even in the midst of his happiness. The circumstance occasioned no alteration, however, in the behaviour of his benefactors. After another fortnight, when the fine warm weather had fairly begun, and every tree and flower was putting forth its young leaves and rich blossoms, they made preparations for quitting the house at Chertsey for some months. It was a lovely spot to which they repaired. Oliver, whose days had been spent among squalid crowds and in the midst of noise and brawling, seemed to enter on a new existence there. So 3 months glided away, 3 months which, in the life of the most blessed and favoured of mortals, might have been unmingled happiness, and which in Oliver's were true felicity. One beautiful night the two ladies had taken a longer walk than was customary, until they had far exceeded their ordinary bounds. Mrs. Maylie being fatigued, they returned more slowly home. The young lady, merely throwing off her simple bonnet, sat down to the piano as usual. After running her fingers abstractedly over the keys for a few minutes, she fell into a low and very solemn air. And as she played there came a sound as if she were weeping. "Not ill, my love?" interposed Mrs. Maylie. Covering her face with her hands, Rose sank upon a sofa and gave vent to the tears which she was now unable to repress. "My child," said the elderly lady, folding her arms about her, "I never saw you so before." "I would not alarm you if I could avoid it," rejoined Rose. "But indeed I have tried very hard and cannot help this. I fear I am ill, aunt." An anxious night ensued. When morning came, Rose was in the first stage of a high and dangerous fever. Before midnight she was delirious. Late at night Mr. Losberne arrived.
It's hard, so young and so much beloved, but there is very little hope.
Another morning. The sun shone brightly, as if it looked upon no misery or care, and the fair young creature lay wasting fast. Oliver crept away to the old churchyard, and sitting down on one of the green mounds, wept and prayed for her in silence. When he reached home, Mrs. Maylie was sitting in the little parlour. They sat listening, and afraid to speak for hours. Then their quick ears caught the sound of an approaching footstep. They both involuntarily darted to the door as Mr. Losberne entered. "What of Rose?" cried the old lady. "Tell me at once."
You must compose yourself," said the doctor, supporting her. "Be calm, my dear ma'am, pray."
"Let me go, in God's name. My dear child, she is dead. She is dying."
"No," cried the doctor passionately. "As he is good and merciful, she will live to bless us all for years to come. What? Ha, 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 ha."
It was almost too much happiness to bear. Oliver felt stunned and stupefied by the unexpected intelligence. He had scarcely the power of understanding anything that had passed until, after a long ramble in the quiet evening air, a burst of tears came to his relief, and he seemed to awaken all at once to a full sense of the joyful change that had occurred. The night was fast closing in when he returned homeward. As he walked briskly along the road, he heard behind him the noise of some vehicle approaching. Looking round, he saw that it was a post-chaise, driven at great speed, and as the horses were galloping and the road was narrow, he stood leaning against a gate until it should have passed him. As it dashed on, Oliver caught a glimpse of a man in a white nightcap, whose face seemed familiar to him. In another second or two, the nightcap was thrust out of the chaise window, and a stentorian voice bellowed to the driver to stop. Then the nightcap once again appeared, and the same voice called Oliver by his name.
"Here!" cried the voice. "Master Oliver! What's the news, Miss Rose? Master Oliver!"
"Is it you, Giles?" cried Oliver, running up to the chaise door. Giles popped out his nightcap again, preparatory to making some reply, when he was suddenly pulled back by a young gentleman who occupied the other corner of the chaise, and who eagerly demanded what was the news. "In a word," cried the gentleman, "better or worse?" "Better, much better," replied Oliver hastily. "Thank heaven!" exclaimed the young gentleman. "I think you'd better go on to my mother's in the chaise, Giles. I would rather walk slowly on, so as to gain a little time before I see her. You can say I'm coming."
"I beg your pardon, Mr. Harry," said Giles, "but if you would leave the postboy to say that, I should be very much obliged to you. It wouldn't be proper for the maids to see me in this state, sir. I should never have any more authority with them if they did."
"Well," rejoined Harry Maylie, smiling, "you can do as you like. Let him go on with the luggage if you wish it, and do you follow with us. Only first exchange that nightcap for some more appropriate covering, or we shall be taken for madmen." Mrs. Maylie was anxiously waiting to receive her son when he reached the cottage. The meeting did not take place without great emotion on both sides. "Mother, why did you not write before?" "I did, but on reflection I determined to keep back the letter until I had heard Mr. Losberne's opinion. The mental agony I have suffered during the last 2 days wrings from me the avowal to you of a passion which, as you well know, is not one of yesterday, nor one I have lightly formed. On Rose, sweet gentle girl, my heart is set as firmly as ever heart of man was set on woman." "What I would say," resumed the old lady, stopping her son as he was about to continue, "is this. Before you stake your all on this chance, reflect for a few moments, my dear child, on Rose's history, and consider what effect the knowledge of her doubtful birth may have on her decision, devoted as she is to us. With all the intensity of her noble mind, and with that perfect sacrifice of self which in all matters great or trifling has always been her characteristic." "What do you mean?" "That I leave you to discover," replied Mrs. Maylie. "I must go back to her. God bless you." Each passing day saw Rose more recovered. She left her room, was able to go out, and mixing once more with the family, carried joy into the hearts of all. But although this happy change had a visible effect on the little circle, there was at times an unwonted restraint upon some there, even upon Rose herself, which Oliver could not fail to remark. At length, one morning, when Rose was alone in the breakfast parlour, Harry Maylie entered, and with some hesitation begged permission to speak with her for a few moments. "There is no pursuit more worthy of me, more worthy of the highest nature that exists, than the struggle to win such a heart as yours," said the young man, taking her hand. "Rose, my own dear Rose, if true, honest, ardent love were ever felt by man, it is the love I bear to you. Tell me I may make some effort to deserve you." "You must endeavour to forget me," replied Rose. Not as your old and dearly attached companion, for that would wound me deeply, but as the object of your love. Look into the world. Think how many hearts you will be proud to gain are there. Confide some other passion to me, if you will. I will be the truest, warmest, and most faithful friend you have." There was a pause, during which Rose, who had covered her face with one hand, gave free vent to her tears. Harry still retained the other. "And your reasons, Rose," he said at length, in a low voice. "Your reasons for this decision." "The prospect before you," answered Rose, "is a brilliant one. All the honours to which great talents and powerful connections can help men in public life are in store for you. But these connections are proud, and I will neither mingle with such as may hold in scorn the mother who gave me life, nor bring disgrace of failure on the son of her who has so well supplied that mother's place. In a word," said the young lady, turning away, as her temporary firmness forsook her, "there is a stain upon my name, which the world visits on innocent heads. I will carry it into no blood but my own, and the reproach shall rest alone with me." "I ask only one promise," said Harry, "once and only once more. Say within a year, but it may be much sooner, I may speak to you again on this subject for the last time." "Not to press me to alter my right determination," replied Rose with a melancholy smile. "It will be useless." "No," said Harry, "to hear you repeat it, if you will. Finally repeat it. I will lay at your feet whatever of station or fortune I may possess, and if you still adhere to your present resolution, will not seek by word or act to change it." "Then let it be so," rejoined Rose. "It is but one pang the more, and by that time I may be enabled to bear it better." She extended her hand again, but the young man caught her to his bosom, and imprinting one kiss on her beautiful forehead, hurried from the room. Mr. Bumble sat in the workhouse parlour, with his eyes moodily fixed on the cheerless grate, whence, as it was summer-time, no brighter gleam proceeded than the reflection of certain sickly rays of the sun, which were sent back from its cold and shining surface. The laced coat and the cocked hat, where were they? He still wore knee-breeches and dark cotton stockings on his nether limbs, but they were not the breeches. The coat was white-skirted, and in that respect like the coat, but oh, how different! The mighty cocked hat was replaced by a modest round one. Mr. Bumble was no longer a beadle. Mr. Bumble had married Mrs. Corney, matron of the workhouse, and was himself master of the workhouse. Another beadle had come into power. On him the cocked hat, gold-lace coat, and staff had all three descended.
"And tomorrow 2 months it was done," said Mr. Bumble with a sigh. "It seems an age, all in 2 months," he repeated, filled with dismal thoughts. 2 months! No more than 2 months ago I was not only my own master, but everybody else's so far as the parochial workhouse was concerned. And now it was too much. Mr. Bumble left the room, boxed the ears of the boy who opened the gate for him, and walked distractedly into the street. He passed a great many public houses, but at length paused before one in a byway, whose parlour, as he gathered from a hasty peep over the blinds, was deserted save by one solitary customer. The man who was seated there was tall and dark, and wore a large cloak. He had the air of a stranger, and seemed by a certain haggardness on his look, as well as by the dusty soils on his dress, to have travelled some distance.
"Were you looking for me when you peered in at the window?"
"Not that I'm aware of, unless you're Mr.
Here Mr. Bumble stopped short, for he was curious to know the stranger's name, and thought in his impatience he might supply the blank.
"I see you were not,"
said the stranger, an expression of quiet sarcasm playing about his mouth.
"or you would have known my name. You don't know it. I would recommend you not to ask for it. Now listen to me. I came down to this place today to find you out, and by one of those chances which the devil throws in the way of its friends sometimes, you walked into the very room I was sitting in, while you were uppermost in my mind. Be quick in answering what I ask you, for I want to reach the place I am to sleep in before the cursed black night comes on. Carry your memory back, let me see, 12 years last winter."
"It's a long time," said Mr. Bumble. Very good. I've done it.
The scene, the workhouse.
Good.
And the time, night.
Yes.
And the place, the crazy hole, wherever it was, in which miserable drabs brought forth the life and health so often denied to themselves, gave birth to puling children for the parish to rear, and hid their shame rottum in the grave.
Oh, the lying-in room, I suppose,
said Mr. Bumble, not quite following the stranger's excited description.
Yes, a boy was born there, a meek-looking, pale-faced hound who was apprenticed down here to a coffin-maker. I wish he'd made his coffin and screwed his body into it, and who afterwards ran away to London, as it was supposed.
Why, you mean Oliver? Young Twist. I remember him, of course. There wasn't an obstinater young rascal.
It's not of him I want to hear. I've heard enough of him,
said the stranger, stopping Mr. Bumble in the outset of a tirade on the subject of poor Oliver's vices.
It's of a woman, the hag that nursed his mother. Where is she?
Oh, she died last winter,
rejoined Mr. Bumble. The man looked fixedly at him when he had given this information. For some time he appeared doubtful whether he ought to be relieved or disappointed by the intelligence. But at length he breathed more freely, and withdrawing his eyes observed that it was no great matter. With that he rose as if to depart. Mr. Bumble at once saw that an opportunity was open for the lucrative disposal of some secret in the possession of his better half. He well remembered the night of old Sally's death, which the occurrences of that day had given him good reason to recollect, as the occasion on which he had proposed to Mrs. Corney. And although that lady had never confided to him the disclosure of which he had been the solitary witness, he had heard enough to know that it related to something that had occurred in the old woman's attendance as workhouse nurse upon the young mother of Oliver Twist. Hastily calling this circumstance to mind, he informed the stranger, with an air of mystery, that one woman had been closeted with the old harridan shortly before she died, and that she could, as he had reason to believe, throw some light on the subject of his inquiry.
"How can I find her?"
said the stranger, thrown off his guard, and plainly showing that all his fears, whatever they were aroused afresh by the intelligence.
"Only through me,"
rejoined Mr. Bumble.
"When?"
cried the stranger hastily.
"Tomorrow," rejoined Bumble.
"At 9 in the evening,"
said the stranger, producing a scrap of paper and writing down upon it an obscure address by the waterside.
"At 9 in the evening, bring her to me there."
With these words he led the way to the door, and remarking that their roads were different, he departed. On glancing at the address, the parochial functionary observed that it contained no name. The stranger had not gone far, so he made after him to ask it.
"What do you want?"
cried the man, turning quickly round as Bumble touched him on the arm.
"Following me?"
"Only to ask a question,"
said the other, pointing to the scrap of paper.
"What name am I to ask for?"
"Monks,"
rejoined the man, and strode hastily away. It was a dull, close, overcast summer evening, when Mr. and Mrs. Bumble directed their course towards a scattered little colony of ruinous houses bordering upon the river.
"The place should be somewhere here,"
said Bumble, consulting a scrap of paper he held in his hand.
"Hello there!"
cried a voice from above. Following the sound, Mr. Bumble raised his head and descried a man looking out of a door breast-high on the second story.
"Stand still a minute,"
cried the voice.
"I'll be with you directly."
"Now," said Monks, when they had all three seated themselves,
"the sooner we come to our business, the better for all. The woman knows what it is, does she?" "What's it worth to you?" asked the woman collectedly. "It may be nothing, it may be £20, replied Monks. "Speak out, and let me know which." "When this woman, that we called Old Sally, died," the matron began, "she and I were alone. She spoke of a young creature who had brought a child into the world some years before. The child was the one that you named to him last night," said the matron, nodding carelessly towards her husband. "The mother this nurse had robbed." "In life?" asked Monks.
"In death," replied the woman with something like a shudder.
"She stole from the corpse that which the dead mother had prayed her with her last breath to keep for the infant's sake." "Where is it now?" asked Monks quickly.
"There," replied the woman, and as if glad to be relieved of it, she hastily threw upon the table a small kid bag scarcely large enough for a French watch, which Monks, pouncing upon, tore open with trembling hands. It contained a little gold locket, in which were 2 locks of hair and a plain gold wedding ring. "It has the word Agnes engraved on the inside," said the woman. "There is a blank left for the surname, and then follows the date, which is within a year before the child was born. I found out that." "And this is all," said Monks, after a close and eager scrutiny of the contents of the little packet. "All," replied the woman. Monks suddenly wheeled the table aside, and pulling an iron ring in the boarding, threw back a large trapdoor which opened close at Mr. Bumble's feet, and caused that gentleman to retire several paces backward with great precipitation. "Look down," said Monks, lowering the lantern into the gulf. "Don't fear me. I could have let you down quietly enough when you were seated over it, if that had been my game." He drew the little packet from his breast, where he'd hurriedly thrust it, and tying it to a leaden weight, dropped it into the stream. It fell straight and true as a die, clove the water with a scarcely audible splash, and was gone. "If we meet again, anywhere, there's no call for us to know each other. You understand?"
"You may depend upon my not saying a word to you, young man, or about you on no account."
"I am glad for your sake to hear it. Light your lantern and get away from here as fast as you can." On the evening following, Mr. William Sikes, awakening from a nap, drowsily growled forth an inquiry what time of night it was. Seated by the window, busily engaged in patching an old waistcoat, which formed a portion of the robber's ordinary dress, was a female, so pale and reduced that there would have been considerable difficulty in recognizing her as the same Nancy who had already figured in this tale, but for the voice in which she replied to Mr. Sikes' question. "Not long gone 7, said the girl. "How'd you feel tonight, Bill?"
"As weak as water. Here, lend us a hand and let me get off this thundering bed in here."
"What's the matter here?" said Fagin, looking in.
"What evil wind has blowed you here? What are you going to say to yourself, you withered old fence, eh?"
Don't be out of temper, my dear. I've never forgot you, Bill, never once."
"It's all very well. I must have some blunt from you tonight."
Well, I'll send the artful round presently."
"You won't do anything of the kind. Nancy shall go and fetch you to make all sure, and I'll lie down and have a snooze while she's gone."
After a great deal of haggling and squabbling, Fagin beat down the amount of the required advance from £5 to £3 4 and 6pence. He then, taking leave of his affectionate friend, returned homeward, attended by Nancy and the boys. In due course they arrived at Fagin's abode, where they found Toby Crackit and Mr. Chitlin engaged upon their 15th game at cribbage. "Now," said Fagin, "I'll go and get you that cash, Nancy." Fagin, lighting a candle and taking the key in his hand, was suddenly stopped by hearing that the boys, in going out, had encountered some person at the street door. "Hush!" he said, hastily concealing the key in his breast. "Who's that? Listen!" Laying his skinny forefinger upon his lip, Fagin carried a candle to the door as a man's step was heard upon the stairs without. He reached it at the same moment as the visitor, who, coming hastily into the room, was close upon the girl before he observed her. It was Monks. "Only one of my young people," said Fagin, observing that Monks drew back on beholding a stranger. "Don't move, Nancy." Fagin laughed, and led his companion to the 2nd story. Before the sound of their footsteps had ceased to echo through the house, the girl had slipped off her shoes. She glided from the room, ascended the stairs with incredible softness and silence, and was lost in the gloom above. The room remained deserted for a quarter of an hour or more. The girl glided back with the same unearthly tread, and immediately afterwards the 2 men were heard descending. Monks went at once into the street, and Fagin crawled upstairs again for the money. When he returned, the girl was adjusting her shawl and bonnet, as if preparing to be gone. When the girl had got into the open street, she sat down upon a doorstep and seemed for a few moments wholly bewildered and unable to pursue her way. Suddenly she arose, and hurrying on in a direction opposite to that in which Sikes was awaiting her return, quickened her pace until it gradually resolved into a violent run. When she reached the more wealthy quarter of the town, the streets were comparatively deserted, and when she neared her place of destination, she was alone. It was a family hotel, in a quiet but handsome street near Hyde Park. She loitered for a few paces, but then she stepped into the hall. The porter's seat was vacant. She looked round with an air of incertitude and advanced towards the stairs. "Now, young woman," said a smartly dressed female, looking out from a door behind her, "who do you want here?"
"A lady who is stopping in this house," answered the girl.
"A lady?" was the reply, accompanied with a scornful look. "What lady?"
"Miss Maylie," said
Nancy. Having returned from the country, the Maylie household had transferred to pleasant quarters at this hotel near Hyde Park, and here Nancy was set to wait in a small antechamber, lighted by a lamp from the ceiling. The girl's life had been squandered in the street, and among the most noisome of the stews and dens of London, but there was something of the woman's original nature left in her still, and when she heard a light step approaching, she felt burdened with the sense of her own deep shame, and shrunk as though she could scarcely bear the presence of her with whom she sought this interview. She raised her eyes sufficiently to observe that the figure which presented itself was that of a slight and beautiful girl.
"Tell me why you wished to see me," said Rose. "I am the person you inquired for." "Oh, lady, lady," said Nancy, "I'm about to put my life and the lives of others in your hands. I am the girl that dragged little Oliver back to old Fagin's on the night he went out from the house in Pentonville."
"You?" said Rose Maylie.
"I, lady," replied the girl. "I am the infamous creature you have heard of. I have stolen away from those who would surely murder me if they knew I had been here, to tell you what I have overheard. Do you know a man named Monks?"
"No."
"He knows you, and knew you were here, for it was by hearing him tell this place that I found you out."
"I never heard the name," said Rose.
"Then he must go by some other, which I more than thought before. Some time ago, and soon after Oliver was put into your house on the night of the robbery, I, suspecting this man, listened to a conversation held between him and Fagin in the dark. I found out from what I heard that Monks, the man I asked about, you know—"
"Yes," said Rose.
"I understand. That Monks had seen him accidentally with two of our boys on the day we first lost him, and had known him directly to be the same child that he was watching for, though I couldn't make out why. A bargain was struck with Fagin that if Oliver was got back, he should have a certain sum, and he was to have more for making him a thief, which this Monks wanted for some purpose of his own. Tonight he came again, and I listened at the door. The first words I heard Monks say were these: 'So the only proofs of the boy's identity lie at the bottom of the river.' Then he said, with oaths common enough in my ears but strange to yours, that if he could gratify his hatred by taking the boy's life without bringing his own neck in danger, he would. But as he couldn't, he'd be upon the watch to meet him at every turn in his life, and if he took advantage of his birth and history, he might harm him yet. In short, Fagin, he says, you never laid such snares as I'll contrive for my young brother Oliver."
"His brother?" exclaimed Rose.
"Those were his words,"
said Nancy, glancing uneasily round, as she had scarcely ceased to do since he began to speak, for a vision of Sikes haunted her perpetually.
"And more. When he spoke of you and the other lady, and said it seemed contrived by heaven or the devil against him that Oliver should come into your hands, he laughed, and said there was some comfort in that too, for how many thousands and hundreds of thousands of pounds would you not give, if you had them, to know who your two-legged spaniel was?"
"Stay another moment," interposed Rose, as the girl moved hurriedly towards the door. "Think on your own condition, and the opportunity you have of escaping from it."
"You would serve me best, lady," replied the girl, wringing her hands, "if you could take my life at once, for I have felt more grief to think of what I am tonight than I ever did before, and it would be something not to die in the hell in which I have lived."
Thus speaking, and sobbing aloud, the unhappy creature turned away, while Rose Maylie, overpowered by this extraordinary interview, sank into a chair and endeavoured to collect her wandering thoughts. After communing with herself, Rose arrived at the desperate conclusion of consulting Harry. She had taken up her pen and laid it down again 50 times, and had considered and reconsidered the first line of her letter without writing the first word, when Oliver, who had been walking in the street with Mr. Giles for a bodyguard, entered the room in such breathless haste and violent agitation as seemed to betoken some new cause of alarm. "I have seen the gentleman," replied Oliver, scarcely able to articulate. "The gentleman who was so good to me, Mr. Brownlow, that we so often talked about." "Where?" asked Rose. "Getting out of a coach," replied Oliver, shedding tears of delight, "and going into a house. I didn't speak to him. I couldn't speak to him, for he didn't see me, and I trembled so I was not able to go up to him. But Giles asked for me whether he lived there, and they said he did. Look here," said Oliver, opening a scrap of paper. "Here it is. Here's where he lives. I'm going there directly. Oh dear me, what shall I do when I come to see him and hear him speak again?" With her attention not little distracted by these and a great many other incoherent exclamations of joy, Rose read the address, which was Craven Street in the Strand. She very soon determined upon turning the discovery to account. "Quick, tell them to fetch a hackney coach and be ready to go with me. I will take you there directly without a minute's loss of time. I will only tell my aunt we are going out for an hour, and be ready as soon as you are." Oliver needed no prompting to dispatch, and in little more than 5 minutes they were on their way to Craven Street. When they arrived there, Rose left Oliver in the coach under the pretence of preparing the old gentleman to receive him, and sending up her card by the servant, requested to see Mr. Brownlow on very pressing business. The servant soon returned, to beg that she would walk upstairs, and following him into an upper room, Miss Maylie was presented to an elderly gentleman of benevolent appearance in a bottle green coat. At no great distance from whom was seated another old gentleman in nankeen breeches and gaiters, who did not look particularly benevolent, and who was sitting with his hands clasped on the top of a thick stick, and his chin propped thereupon. "Dear me," said the gentleman in the bottle green coat, hastily rising with great politeness, "I beg your pardon, young lady. I imagined it was some importunate person who— I beg you will excuse me. Be seated, pray." "Mr. Brownlow, I believe, sir?" said Rose, glancing from the other gentleman to the one who had spoken. "That is my name," said the old gentleman. "This is my friend Mr. Grimwig. Grimwig, will you leave us for a few minutes?" "I believe," interposed Miss Maylie, "that at this period of our interview I need not give that gentleman the trouble of going away. If I am correctly informed, he is cognizant of the business on which I wish to speak to you." Mr. Brownlow inclined his head. Mr. Grimwig, who had made one very stiff bow and risen from his chair, made another very stiff bow and dropped into it again. "I shall surprise you very much, I have no doubt," said Rose, naturally embarrassed. "But you once showed great benevolence and goodness to a very dear young friend of mine, and I am sure you will take an interest in hearing of him again." "Indeed," said Mr. Brownlow. "May I ask his name?" "Oliver Twist, you knew him as," replied Rose. The words no sooner escaped her lips than Mr. Grimwig, who had been affecting to dip into a large book that lay on the table, upset it with a great crash. Mr. Brownlow was no less surprised. He drew his chair nearer to Miss Maylie's and said, "Will you let me know, my dear young lady, what intelligence you have of this poor child?" Rose at once related, in a few natural words, all that had befallen Oliver since he left Mr. Brownlow's house, reserving Nancy's information for that gentleman's private ear, and concluding with the assurance that Oliver's only sorrow for some months past had been the not being able to meet with his former benefactor and friend. "Thank God," said the old gentleman, "this is great happiness to me. But why have you not brought him?" "He is waiting in a coach at the door," replied Rose. "At this door?" cried the old gentleman, with which he hurried out of the room, down the stairs, up the coach steps, and into the coach without another word. Mr. Brownlow returned, accompanied by Oliver, whom Mr. Grimwig received very graciously. "There is somebody else who should not be forgotten by the by," said Mr. Brownlow, ringing the bell. "Send Mrs. Bedwin here, if you please." The old housekeeper answered the summons with all dispatch, and dropping a curtsy at the door, waited for orders. "Why, you get blinder every day, Bedwin," said Mr. Brownlow rather testily. "Well, that I do, sir," replied the old lady. "People's eyes at my time of life don't improve with age, sir." "I could have told you that," rejoined Mr. Brownlow. "Put on your glasses and see if you can't find out what you're wanted for, will you?" The old lady began to rummage in her pocket for her spectacles, but Oliver's patience was not proof against this new trial, and yielding to his first impulse, he sprang into her arms. God be good to me, cried the old lady, embracing him. It is my innocent boy. Leaving her and Oliver to compare notes at leisure, Mr. Brownlow led the way to another room, and there heard from Rose a full narration of her interview with Nancy, which occasioned him no little surprise and perplexity. Rose also explained that she had not confided in her friend Mr. Losberne in the first instance, for fear of his precipitate action. The old gentleman considered that she had acted prudently, and readily undertook to hold solemn conference with the worthy doctor himself. To afford him an early opportunity for the execution of this design, it was arranged that he should call at the hotel at 8 o'clock that evening, and that in the meantime Mrs. Maylie should be cautiously informed of all that had happened. The meeting took place that evening, and Rose had by no means overrated the measure of the good doctor's wrath. Nancy's history was no sooner unfolded to him than he poured forth a shower of mingled threats and execrations. "Oh, what the devil's to be done?" said the impetuous doctor at length. "We must proceed gently and with great care," rejoined Mr. Brownlow. "Gentleness and care? Oh, I'd send them one and all to never mind where, but reflect whether sending them anywhere is likely to attain the object we have in view." "Oh, what object?" "Simply the discovery of Oliver's parentage, and regaining for him the inheritance, of which, if this story be true, he had been fraudulently deprived." "Ah," said Mr. Losberne, cooling himself with his pocket-handkerchief. "Almost forgot that." "You see," pursued Mr. Brownlow, "placing poor Nancy entirely out of the question, and supposing it were possible to bring these scoundrels to justice without compromising her safety, what good should we bring about? No, it is quite clear that we shall have an extreme difficulty in getting to the bottom of this mystery unless we can bring this man Monks upon his knees. Now I should like to call in the aid of my friend Grimwig. He is a strange creature, but a shrewd one, and might prove of material assistance to us." "Well, I have no objection to your calling in your friend, if I may call in mine," said the doctor. "We must put it to the vote," replied Mr. Brownlow. "Who may he be?" "That lady's son, and this young lady's very old friend," said the doctor, motioning towards Mrs. Maylie and concluding with an expressive glance at her niece. Rose blushed deeply, but she did not make any audible objection to this motion. Possibly she felt in a hopeless minority, and Harry Maylie and Mr. Grimwig were accordingly added to the committee. Adept as she was in all the arts of cunning and dissimulation, the girl Nancy could not wholly conceal the effect which the knowledge of the step she had taken wrought upon her mind. Often she sat silent and dejected, brooding with her head upon her hands. It was Sunday night, and the bell of the nearest church struck the hour. Sikes and Fagin were talking, but they paused to listen. The girl looked up from the low seat on which she was crouched, and listened too. 11 o'clock. Fagin pulled Sikes by the sleeve, pointed his finger towards Nancy, who had taken advantage of the foregoing conversation to put on her bonnet, and was now leaving the room. "Hello, Nance! Where's the girl going to at this time of night?" "I'm not well. I told you that before," rejoined the girl. "I want a breath of air." "Put your head out the window." "It's not enough there. I want it in the street." "And you won't have it." "Let me go," said the girl with great earnestness. Then sitting herself down on the floor before the door, she said, "Bill, let me go. You don't know what you're doing. You don't indeed. For only 1 hour. Do.
"Cut off my limbs one by one if I don't think the girl's stark raving mad. Get up!"
"Not till you let me go. Not till you let me go. Never. Never."
Sikes looked on for a minute, watching his opportunity, and suddenly, pinioning her hands, dragged her, struggling and wrestling with him all the way, into a small room adjoining, where he sat himself on a bench and, thrusting her into a chair, held her down by force. With a caution backed by many oaths to make no more efforts to go out that night, Sikes left her to recover at leisure, and rejoined Fagin.
"Oh," said the housebreaker, wiping the perspiration from his face. "What a precious strange girl that is."
"You may say that, Bill," replied Fagin thoughtfully. "You may say that." Fagin walked towards his own home, intent upon the thoughts that were working within his brain. He had conceived the idea, not from what had just passed, though that had tended to confirm him, but slowly and by degrees, that Nancy, wearied of the housebreaker's brutality, had conceived an attachment for some new friend. If, without extracting a confession from herself, he laid a watch, discovered the object of her altered regard, and threatened to reveal the whole history to Sikes unless she entered into his designs, could he not secure her compliance against the hated Sikes? "I can," said Fagin almost aloud. "She durst not refuse me then." He cast back a dark look and a threatening motion of the hand towards the spot where he had left the bolder villain, and went on his way, busying his bony hands in the folds of his tattered garment, which he wrenched very tightly in his grasp, as though he were a hated enemy crushed with every motion of his fingers. On an evening, some days later, Fagin's plan was put into effect. The church clocks chimed 11:15, as two figures emerged on London Bridge. One was that of a woman who looked eagerly about her, as though in quest of some expected object. The other figure was that of a man, who slunk along in the deepest shadow he could find, and at some distance accommodated his pace to hers, stopping when she stopped, and as she moved again, creeping stealthily on, but never allowing himself, in the ardour of his pursuit, to gain upon her footsteps. The girl had taken a few restless turns to and fro, closely watched meanwhile by her hidden observer, when the heavy bell of St. Paul's tolled for the death of another day. The hour had not struck 2 minutes when a young lady, accompanied by a grey-haired gentleman, alighted from a hackney carriage within a short distance of the bridge, and, having dismissed the vehicle, walked straight towards it. They had scarcely set foot upon its pavement when the girl started and immediately made towards them. "Not here," said Nancy hurriedly. "I'm afraid to speak to you here. Come away, out of the public road, down the steps yonder." The follower drew himself straight upright against the wall, and scarcely breathed, listening attentively. "Good," said the gentleman. "Now listen to me." "I'm ready," replied the girl, as she paused for a moment. "This young lady has communicated to me, and to some other friends who can be safely trusted, what you told her nearly a fortnight since. I confess to you that I had doubts at first whether you were to be implicitly relied upon, but now I firmly believe you are." "I am," said the girl earnestly. "Then," said the gentleman quickly, as if this had been the point he had been aiming to attain, "put Monks into my hands and leave him to me to deal with." "Monks would never learn how you knew what you do?" said the girl after a short pause. "Never," replied the gentleman. "He is tall," said the girl, "and a strongly made man, but not stout. His lips are often discoloured and disfigured with the marks of teeth, for he has desperate fits, and sometimes even bites his hands and covers them with wounds." "Why did you start?" said the girl, stopping suddenly. The gentleman replied in a hurried manner that he was not conscious of having done so, and begged her to proceed. "Upon his throat," she continued, "so high that you can see a part of it below his neckerchief when he turns his face, there is—" "A broad red mark, like a burn or scald," cried the gentleman. "How's this?" said the girl. "You know him?" The young lady uttered a cry of surprise, and for a few moments they were so still that the listener could scarcely hear them breathe. "I think I do," said the gentleman, breaking silence. "I should by your description. We shall see. Many people are singularly like each other. It may not be the same." As he expressed himself to this effect with assumed carelessness, he took a step or two nearer the concealed spy, as the latter could tell from the distinctness with which he heard him mutter, "It must be he." Rose Maylie lingered, but the old gentleman drew her arm through his and led her with gentle force away. As they disappeared, the girl sunk down nearly at her full length upon one of the stone stairs, and vented the anguish of her heart in bitter tears. Peeping out more than once, when he reached the top, to make sure that he was unobserved, the spy darted away at his utmost speed, and made for Fagin's house as fast as his legs would carry him. It was nearly 2 hours before daybreak, that time which in the autumn of the year may be truly called the dead of night. Fagin sat watching in his old lair with face so distorted and pale, and eyes so red and bloodshot, that he looked less like a man than like some hideous phantom. Stretched upon a mattress on the floor lay Fagin's spy, fast asleep. Towards him the old man sometimes directed his eyes for an instant, and then brought them back again to the candle, which, with a long, burnt wick drooping almost double, and hot grease falling down in clots upon the table, plainly showed that his thoughts were busy elsewhere. Indeed they were. Mortification at the overthrow of his notable scheme, hatred of the girl who had dared to palter with strangers, an utter distrust of the sincerity of her refusal to yield him up, bitter disappointment at the loss of his revenge on Sykes, the fear of detection and ruin and death, and a fierce and deadly rage kindled by all these. These were the passionate considerations which, following close upon each other with rapid and ceaseless whirl, shot through the brain of Fagin, as every evil thought and blackest purpose lay working at his heart. The bell rang gently. He crept upstairs to the door, and presently returned accompanied by a man muffled to the chin, who carried a bundle under one arm. Sitting down and throwing back his outer coat, the man displayed the burly frame of Sykes. "There," he said, laying the bundle on the table. "Take care of that, and do the most you can with it. It's been trouble enough to get. I thought I should have been here 3 hours ago." Fagin laid his hand upon the bundle, and locking it in the cupboard, turned to Sykes and said, "Suppose that lad that's lying there was to peach, to blow us all, first seeking out the right folks for the purpose, and then having a meeting with them in the street to paint our likeness, describe every mark they might know us by, and the crib where we might most easily be taken. Suppose he did all this. What then?"
"What then?" replied Sykes with a tremendous oath. "If he was left alive till I came, I'd grind his skull under the iron heel of me boot into as many grains as there are hairs on his head."
Fagin bent over the sleeper and hauled him into a sitting posture. "Tell me that again, once again, just for him to hear," said Fagin, pointing to Sykes as he spoke.
Tell you what,
asked the sleepy youth, shaking himself pettishly. "That about Nancy," said Fagin, clutching Sykes by the wrist, as if to prevent his leaving the house before he had heard enough. "You, followed her?"
yeah,
"To London Bridge?"
yeah,
"Where she met 2 people?"
so she did.
"A gentleman and a lady that she had gone to of her own accord before, who asked her to give up all her pals and monks first, which she did, and to describe him, which she did, and tell her what house it was that we meet at and go to, which she did, and where it could be best watched from, which she did, and what time the people went there, which she did. She did all this. She told it all, every word, without a threat, without a murmur. She did she not?" cried Fagin, half mad with fury.
"Hell's fire!" cried Sykes, breaking fiercely from Fagin. "Let me go!"
Flinging the old man from him, he rushed from the room. Without once turning his head to the right or the left, the robber held on his headlong course until he reached his own door. The girl was lying half-dressed upon the bed. He had roused her from her sleep, for she raised herself with a hurried and startled look.
"Get up!"
"Bill," said the girl in a low voice of alarm, "why'd you look like that at me?" The robber sat regarding her for a few seconds, with dilated nostrils and heaving breast, and then, grasping her by the head and throat, dragged her into the middle of the room, and, looking once towards the door, placed his heavy hand upon her mouth. "Bill! Bill!" gasped the girl, wrestling with the strength of mortal fear. I won't scream or cry, not once. Hear me, speak to me, tell me what I done."
"You know, you she-devil," returned the robber, suppressing his breath. "You were watched tonight. Every word you said was heard."
The housebreaker freed one arm and grasped his pistol. The certainty of immediate detection if he fired flashed across his mind, even in the midst of his fury,
and he beat it twice with all the force he could summon upon the upturned face that almost touched his own.
She staggered and fell, nearly blinded with the blood that rained down from a deep gash in her forehead, but raising herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, Rose Maylie's own, and holding it up in her folded hands as high towards heaven as her feeble strength would allow, breathed one prayer for mercy to her Maker.
It was a ghastly figure to look upon, the murderer staggering backward to the wall, and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down.
The twilight was beginning to close in, when Mr. Brownlow alighted from a hackney coach at his own door, and knocked softly. The door being opened, a sturdy man got out of the coach and stationed himself on one side of the steps, while another man who had been seated on the box dismounted too and stood upon the other side. At a sign from Mr. Brownlow, they helped out a third man, and taking him between them, hurried into the house. This man was Monks.
"By what authority am I kidnapped in the street and brought here by these dogs?"
asked Monks, looking from one to the other of the two men who stood beside him. "By mine," replied Mr. Brownlow.
"This is pretty treatment, sir," said Monks, throwing down his hat and cloak, "from my father's oldest friend."
"It is because I was your father's oldest friend that I am moved to treat you gently now. Yes, Edward Leaford, even now, and blush for your unworthiness to bear the name. You have a brother," said Mr. Brownlow, rousing himself, "a brother, the whisper, of whose name in your ear, when I came behind you in the street, was in itself almost enough to make you accompany me hither in wonder and alarm."
"I have no brother. You know I was an only child. Why do you talk to me of brothers? You know that as well as I."
"Attend to what I do know, and you may not. I shall interest you by and by. I know that of the wretched marriage into which family pride and the most sordid and narrowest of all ambition forced your unhappy father when a mere boy, you were the sole and most unnatural issue."
"Well, they were separated, and what of that?"
"When they had been separated for some time, and your mother, wholly given up to continental frivolities, had utterly forgotten her young husband 10 good years her junior, who with prospects blighted lingered on at home, he, your father, fell among new friends. These new friends were a naval officer retired from active service, whose wife had died some half-year before, and 2 children, both daughters, one a beautiful creature of 19, and the other a mere child of 2 or 3 years old. Acquaintance, intimacy, friendship fast followed on each other. Your father was gifted as few men are. As the old officer knew him more and more, he grew to love him. His daughter did the same." The old gentleman paused. Monks was biting his lips with his eyes fixed upon the floor. Seeing this, he immediately resumed. "The end of a year found your father solemnly contracted, to that daughter, the object of the first, true, ardent, only passion of a guileless girl."
"Your tale is of the longest,"
observed Monks, moving restlessly in his chair. "It is a true tale of grief and trial and sorrow, young man, and such tales usually are. If it were one of unmixed joy and happiness, it would be very brief. At length, one of those rich relations to whose interest your father had been sacrificed died, and to repair the misery he had been so instrumental in occasioning, left him his panacea for all griefs, money. It was necessary that your father should immediately repair to Rome, whither this man had sped for health, and where he had died, leaving his affairs in great confusion. Your father went, was seized himself with mortal illness there, was followed the moment the intelligence reached Paris by your mother, who carried you with her. He died in Rome the day after her arrival. Before he went abroad, and as he passed through London on his way," said Mr. Brownlow, slowly, and fixing his eyes upon the other's face, "he came to me."
"I never heard of that,"
interrupted Monks in a tone intended to appear incredulous, but savouring more of disagreeable surprise.
"He came to me, and left with me, among some other things, a picture, a portrait painted by himself, a likeness of this poor girl, which he did not wish to leave behind and could not carry forward on his hasty journey. He was worn by anxiety and remorse almost to a shadow, talked in a wild, distracted way of ruin and dishonour worked by himself, confided to me his intention to convert his whole property, at any loss, into money, and having settled on his wife and you a portion of his recent acquisition, to fly the country. I guessed too well he would not fly alone. Even from me, his old and early friend,
even from me he withheld any more particular confession, promising to write and tell me all, and after that to see me once again for the last time on earth. Alas, that was the last time. I had no letter, and I never saw him more. I went, said Mr. Brownlow after a short pause, I went, when all was over, to the scene of his guilty love, resolved that if my fears were realized, that erring child should find one heart and home to shelter and compassionate her. The family had left that part a week before. They had called in such trifling debts as were outstanding, discharged them, and left the place by night. Why or whither, none can tell. Monks drew his breath yet more freely, and looked round with a smile of triumph. "When your brother," said Mr. Brownlow, drawing nearer to the other's chair, "when your brother, a feeble, ragged, neglected child, was cast in my way by a stronger hand than chance, and rescued by me from a life of vice and infamy—" "What?" cried Monks. "By me? I told you I should interest you before long. I say by me. I see that your cunning associate suppressed my name, although for aught he knew it would be quite strange to your ears. When he was rescued, then, by me, and lay recovering from sickness in my house, his strong resemblance to this picture I have spoken of struck me with astonishment. Even when I first saw him in all his dirt and misery, there was a lingering expression on his face that came upon me like a glimpse of some old friend flashing on one in a vivid dream. I need not tell you he was snared away before I knew his history." "Why not?" asked Monks hastily. "Because you know it well." "I? Denial to me is vain. I shall show you that I know more than that." You can't prove anything against me. I defy you to do it." "We shall see," returned the old gentleman with a searching glance. "I lost the boy, and no efforts of mine could recover him. Your mother being dead, I knew that you alone could solve the mystery if anybody could. And as, when I had last heard of you, you were on your own estate in the West Indies, whither, as you well know, you retired upon your mother's death to escape the consequences of vicious courses here, I made the voyage. You had left it months before, and were supposed to be in London, but no one could tell where. I returned. Your agents had no clue to your residence. You came and went, they said, as strangely as you had ever done, sometimes for days together, sometimes not for months, keeping to all appearance the same low haunts and mingling with the same infamous herd who had been your associates when a fierce, ungovernable boy. I wearied them with new applications. I paced the streets by night and day, but until 2 hours ago all my efforts were fruitless, and I never saw you for an instant." "And now you do see me," said Monks, rising boldly. "What then? Fraud and robbery are high-sounding words, justified, you think, by a fancied resemblance in some young imp to an idle daub of a dead man's brother. Tchah! You don't even know the child was born of this maudlin pair. You don't even know that." "I did not," replied Mr. Brownlow, rising too, "but within the last fortnight I have learnt it all. You have a brother, you know it, and him. There was a will, which your mother destroyed, leaving the secret and the gain to you at her own death. It contained a reference to some child likely to be the result of this sad connection, which child was born, and accidentally encountered by you when your suspicions were first awakened by his resemblance to his father. You repaired to the place of his birth. There existed proofs long suppressed, of his birth and parentage. Those proofs were destroyed by you, and now, in your own words, your accomplice Fagin, the only proofs of the boy's identity lie at the bottom of the river. Unworthy son, coward, liar, you who hold your counsel with thieves and murderers in dark rooms at night, you whose plots and wiles have brought a violent death upon the head of one worth millions such as you who from your cradle were gall and bitterness to your own father's heart, you in whom all evil passions, vice, and profligacy festered, till they found a vent in a hideous disease which has made your face an index even to your mind, you, Edward Leaford, do you brave me still?" "No, no," returned the coward, overwhelmed by these accumulated charges. Every word that has passed between you and this detested villain is known to me. Shadows on the wall have caught your whispers and brought them to my ear. The sight of the persecuted child has turned vice itself, and given it the courage and almost the attributes of virtue. Murder has been done, to which you were morally, if not really, a party. No, no, interposed Monks. I know nothing of that. I was going to inquire the truth of the story when you overtook me. I didn't know the cause. I thought it was a common quarrel. It was the partial disclosure of your secrets, replied Mr. Brownlow. Will you disclose the whole? Yes, I will. Set your hand to a statement of truth and facts and repeat it before witnesses. That I promise to. Remain quietly here until such a document is drawn up, and proceed with me to such a place as I may deem most advisable for the purpose of attesting it. That I'll also do, if you insist upon it. You must do more than that. Make restitution to an innocent and unoffending child, for such he is, although the offspring of a guilty and most miserable love. You have not forgotten the provisions of the will. Carry them into execution so far as your brother is concerned, and then go where you please. In this world we need meet no more. While Monks was pacing up and down, meditating with dark and evil looks on this proposal and the possibilities of evading it, torn by his fears on the one hand and his hatred on the other, the door was hurriedly unlocked, and a gentleman, Mr. Losberne, entered the room in violent agitation. The man will be taken, he cried. He'll be taken tonight. Nancy's murderer? Asked Mr. Brownlow. Yeah. Fagin, said Mr. Brownlow. What of him? When I last heard, he had not been taken. But he will be, or is, by this time. They're sure of him. Have you made up your mind? Mr. Brownlow asked in a low voice of Monks. Yes. You will be secret with me. I will. Remain here until I return. It is your only hope of safety. They left the room, and the door was locked again. What have you done? Asked the doctor in a whisper. All that I could hope to do, and even more. Coupling the poor girl's intelligence with my previous knowledge and the result of our good friend's inquiries on the spot, I left him no loophole of escape, and laid bare the whole villainy by which these lights became plain as day. Now write and appoint the evening after tomorrow at 7 for the meeting. We shall be there a few hours before, but shall require rest, especially Miss Maylie, who may have greater need of firmness than either you or I can quite foresee just now. But my blood boils to avenge this poor murdered creature. Which way have they taken? Drive straight to the office, and you'll be in time, replied Mr. Losberne. I will remain here. The two gentlemen hastily separated, each in a fever of excitement, wholly uncontrollable. Near to that part of the Thames on which the church at Rotherhithe abuts, the buildings on the banks are dirtiest, and the vessels on the river blackest, with the dust of colliers and the smoke of close-built, low-roofed houses. In the upper room of one of these houses there were assembled 3 men. One of these was Toby Crackit, another young Mr. Chitling, Fagin's apprentice, and the third a robber of 50 years whose nose had been almost beaten in some old scuffle, and whose face bore a frightful scar which might probably be traced to the same occasion. This man was a returned transport, and his name was Caggs. Toby Crackit turned to Chitling and said, "When was Fagin took, then?" "Just at dinner time. 2 o'clock this afternoon." "And Bet?" "Poor Bet. She went to see the body to speak to who it was, and went off mad, screaming and raving and beating her head against the boards. So they put a straight waistcoat on her and took her to the hospital, and there she is." The horror-stricken witness of this scene pressed his hands upon his ears, and with his eyes closed got up and paced violently to and fro like one distracted. Suddenly they heard a hurried knocking at the door below. Crackit went down to the door and returned followed by a man with the lower part of his face buried in a handkerchief and another tied over his head under his hat. He drew them slowly off. Blanched face, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, beard of 3 days' growth, wasted flesh, short, thick breath. It was the very ghost of Sykes. "Tonight's paper says that Fagin's took. Is it true or a lie?" "True." They were silent again. "Damn you all," said Sykes, passing his hand across his forehead. "Have you nothing to say to me? Who's that knocking?" Crackit intimated by a motion of his hand as he left the room there was nothing to fear, and directly came back with Charlie Bates behind him. Sykes sat opposite the door, so the moment the boy entered the room he encountered his figure. "Toby!" said the boy, falling back as Sykes turned his eyes towards him. "Why didn't you tell me this downstairs?" "Charlie!" said Sykes, stepping forward. Don't
Don't you know me? Don't you come near me? Answered the boy, looking with horror in his eyes upon the murderer's face. You monster!
All at once Crackit pointed to the window. There were lights gleaming below, voices in a loud and earnest conversation, the tramp of hurried footsteps crossing the nearest wooden bridge. The gleam of lights increased, the footsteps came more thickly and noisily on. Then came a loud knocking at the door, and then a hoarse murmur from such a multitude of angry voices as would have made the boldest quail. "Help!" shrieked the boy in a voice that rent the air. "He's here! Break down the door!"
In the king's name!
cried the voices without, and the hoarse cry arose again, but louder.
Damn you! cried the desperate ruffian. Do your worst! I'll cheat you yet!
Of all the terrific yells that ever fell on mortal ears, none could exceed the cry of the infuriated throng.
The tide! cried the murderer. The tide was in as I came up. Give me a rope, a long rope. I may drop into the folly ditch and clear off that way. Give me a rope or I shall do 3 more murders and kill myself!
The panic-stricken men pointed to where such articles were kept. The murderer, hastily selecting the longest and strongest cord, hurried up to the housetop. The water was out, the ditch a bed of mud. The crowd had been hushed during these few moments, watching his motions and doubtful of his purpose, but the instant they perceived it and knew it was defeated, they raised a cry of triumphant execration. Roused to new strength and energy, and stimulated by the noise within the house, which announced that an entrance had been effected, Sikes set his foot against the stack of chimneys, fastened one end of the rope tightly and firmly round it, and with the other made a strong running noose by the aid of his hands and teeth, almost in a second. He could let himself down by the cord to within a less distance of the ground than his own height, and had his knife ready in his hand to cut it then and drop. At the very instant when he brought the loop over his head, previous to slipping it beneath his armpits, he lost his balance and tumbled over the parapet. The noose was on his neck. It ran up with his weight, tight as a bowstring, and swift as the arrow it speeds. He fell for 25 feet. There was a sudden jerk, a terrific convulsion of the limbs, and there he hung, with the open knife clenched in his stiffening hand. The events narrated in the last chapter were yet but 2 days old when Oliver found himself at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a travelling carriage rolling fast towards his native town. Mrs. Maylie and Rose and Mrs. Bedwin and the good doctor were with him, and Mr. Brownlow followed in a post-chaise, accompanied by one other person whose name had not been mentioned. They drove straight to the door of the chief hotel, and here was Mr. Grimwig all ready to receive them. Dinner was there prepared, and there were bedrooms ready, and everything was arranged as if by magic. At length, when 9 o'clock had come, Mr. Losberne and Mr. Grimwig entered the room, followed by Mr. Brownlow and a man whom Oliver almost shrieked with surprise to see, for they told him it was his brother. Monks cast a look of hate, which even then he could not dissemble, at the astonished boy, and sat down near the door. Mr. Brownlow, who had papers in his hand, walked to a table, near which Rose and Oliver were seated. "This is a painful task, but these declarations, which have been signed in London before many gentlemen, must be in substance repeated here. I would have spared you the degradation, but we must hear them from your own lips before we part, and you know why." "Go on," said the person addressed, turning away his face. "Quick! I have almost done enough, I think. Don't keep me here." "This child," said Mr. Brownlow, drawing Oliver to him, and laying his hand upon his head, "is your half-brother, the illegitimate son of your father, my dear friend Edwin Leaford, by poor young Agnes Fleming, who died in giving him birth." "Yes, that is their bastard child." "The term you use," said Mr. Brownlow sternly, "is a reproach to those who long since passed beyond the feeble censure of the world. It reflects disgrace on no one living except you who use it. Let that pass. He was born in this town." "In the workhouse of this town," was the sullen reply. "You have the story there." He pointed impatiently to the papers as he spoke. "I must have it here, too," said Mr. Brownlow, looking round upon the listeners, who then heard Oliver's true history from the villain's own lips. "Young lady," said Mr. Brownlow, turning to Rose, when Monks had finished his tale, "give me your hand. Do not tremble. You need not fear to hear the few remaining words we have to say. If they have, I do not know how they can, but if they have any reference to me, said Rose, pray let me hear them at some other time. I have not strength or spirits now. Nay, rejoined the old gentleman, drawing her arm through his, you have more fortitude than this, I am sure. Do you know this young lady, sir? Yes, replied Monks. I never saw you before, said Rose faintly. I have seen you often, returned Monks. The father of the unhappy Agnes had 2 daughters, said Mr. Brownlow. What was the fate of the other, the child? The child? When her father died in a strange place, in a strange name, without a letter, book, or scrap of paper that yielded the faintest clue by which his friends or relatives could be traced, the child was taken by some wretched cottagers who reared it as their own. Go on, said Mr. Brownlow, signing to Mrs. Maylie to approach. Go on. You couldn't find the spot to which these people had repaired, but where friendship fails, hatred will often force a way. My mother found it, after a year of cunning search. Aye, and found the child. She took it, did she? No. The people were poor, and began to sicken, at least the man did, of their fine humanity. So she left it with them, giving them a small present of money which would not last long, and promised more which she never meant to send. She didn't quite rely, however, on their discontent and poverty for the child's unhappiness, but told the history of the sister's shame with such alterations as suited her, bade them take good heed of the child, for she came of bad blood, and told them she was illegitimate and sure to go wrong at one time or other. The circumstances countenanced all this, the people believed it, and there the child dragged on an existence, miserable enough to satisfy even us, until a widow lady residing then at Chester saw the girl by chance, pitied her, and took her home. There was some cursed spell, I think, against us, for in spite of all our efforts she remained there and was happy. I lost sight of her 2 or 3 years ago, and saw her no more until a few months back. Do you see her now? Yes, leaning on your arm. But not the less my niece, cried Mrs. Maylie, folding the fainting girl in her arms. Not the less my dearest child. I would not lose her now for all the treasures of the world. My sweet companion, my own dear girl. The only friend I ever had, cried Rose, clinging to her. The kindest, best of friends. My heart will burst. I cannot bear all this. You have borne more, and have been through all, the best and gentlest creature that ever shed happiness on every one she knew, said Mrs. Maylie, embracing her tenderly. Come, come, my love. Remember who this is who wants to clasp you in his arms, poor child. See, here, look, my dear. Not aunt, cried Oliver, throwing his arms about her neck. I'll never call her aunt. Sister, my own dear sister, that something taught my heart to love so dearly from the first. Rose, dear darling Rose. Let the tears that fell, and the broken words which were exchanged in the long, close embrace between the orphans, be sacred. A father, sister, and mother were gained and lost in that one moment. Joy and grief were mingled in the cup, but there were no bitter tears. For even grief itself arose, so softened and clothed in such sweet and tender recollections, that it became a solemn pleasure, and lost all character of pain. They were a long, long time alone. A soft tap at the door at length announced that someone was without. Oliver opened it, glided away, and gave place to Harry Maylie. I know it all, he said, taking a seat beside the lovely girl. Dear Rose, I know it all. I'm not here by accident, nor have I heard all this tonight, for I knew it yesterday, only yesterday. Do you guess that I have come to remind you of a promise? Stay, said Rose. You do know all? All. You gave me leave at any time within the year to renew the subject of our last discourse. I did. Not to press you to alter your determination, but to hear you repeat it, if you would. I was to lay whatever of station or fortune I might possess at your feet, and if you still adhere to your former determination, I pledge myself by no word or act to seek to change it. The same reasons which influenced me then will influence me now, said Rose firmly. If ever I owed a strict and rigid duty to her whose goodness saved me from a life of indigence and suffering, when should I ever feel it as I should tonight? It is a struggle, but one which I am proud to make. It is a pang, but one my heart shall bear.
The disclosure of tonight, Harry began.
The disclosure of tonight, replied Rose softly, leaves me in the same position with reference to you as that in which I stood before. You harden your heart against me, Rose. Oh, Harry, Harry, I wish I could, and spare myself this pain.
Then why inflict it on yourself? Think, dear Rose, think what you have heard tonight.
And what have I heard? What have I heard? Cried Rose. That a sense of his deep disgrace so worked upon my own father that he shunned all? There, we have said enough, Harry, we have said enough.
Not yet, said the young man, detaining her as she rose. My hopes, my wishes, prospects, feeling, every thought in life, except my love for you, have undergone a change. I offer you now no distinction among a bustling crowd, no mingling with a world of malice and detraction, where the blood is called into honest cheeks by aught but real disgrace and shame, but a home, a heart and home, yes, dearest Rose, and those alone are all I have to offer.
What do you mean?
I mean but this, that when I left you last, I left you with a firm determination to level all fancied barriers between yourself and me, resolved that if my world could not be yours, I would make yours mine, that no pride of birth should curl the lip at you, for I would turn from it. This I have done. Those who have shrunk from me because of this have shrunk from you, and proved you so far right. Such power and patronage, such relatives of influence and rank as smiled upon me then, look coldly now. But there are smiling fields and waving trees in England's richest county, and by one village church there stands a rustic dwelling, which you can make me prouder of than all the hopes I have renounced, measured 1,000-fold. This is my rank and station now, and here I lay it down.
The court was paved from floor to roof with human faces. Inquisitive and eager eyes peered from every inch of space. From the rail before the dock, away into the sharpest angle of the smallest corner in the galleries, all looks were fixed upon one man, Fagin. At length there was a cry of silence, and a breathless look from all towards the door. The jury returned, and passed him close. He could glean nothing from their faces. They might as well have been of stone. Perfect stillness ensued, not a rustle, not a breath. Guilty. He was asked if he had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon him. He had resumed his listening attitude and looked intently at his questioner while the demand was made. But it was twice repeated before he seemed to hear it, and then he only muttered that he was an old man. An old man. An old man. And so, dropping into a whisper, was silent again. They led him through a paved room under the court into the interior of the prison. The day passed off. Day. There was no day. It was gone as soon as come. Saturday night. He had only one more night to live. And as he thought of this, the day broke. Sunday. A great multitude was already assembled. The windows were filled with people smoking and playing cards to beguile the time. The crowd were pushing, quarrelling, joking. Everything told of life and animation, but one dark cluster of objects in the centre of all. The black stage, the crossbeam, the rope, and all the hideous apparatus of death. The fortunes of those who have figured in this tale are nearly closed. The little that remains to their historian to relate is told in a few and simple words. Before 3 months had passed, Rose Fleming and Harry Maylie were married in the village church. Mrs. Maylie took up her abode with her son and daughter-in-law to enjoy, during the tranquil remainder of her days, the greatest felicity that age and worth can know, the contemplation of the happiness of those on whom the warmest affections and tenderest care of a well-spent life have been unceasingly bestowed. It appeared, on full and careful investigation, that if the wreck of property remaining in the custody of Monks, which had never prospered either in his hands or in those of his mother, were equally divided between himself and Oliver, it would yield to each little more than £3,000. Mr. Brownlow, unwilling to deprive the elder son of the opportunity of retrieving his former vices and pursuing an honest career, proposed this mode of distribution, to which his young charge joyfully acceded. Monks, still bearing that assumed name, retired with his portion to a distant part of the New World, where, having quickly squandered it, he once more fell into his old courses, and after undergoing a long confinement for some fresh act of fraud and knavery, at length sunk under an attack of his old disorder, and died in prison. Mr. Brownlow adopted Oliver as his son, removing with him and the old housekeeper to within a mile of the parsonage house where his dear friends resided. He gratified the only remaining wish of Oliver's warm and earnest heart, and thus linked together a little society whose condition approached as nearly to one of perfect happiness as can ever be known in this changing world. Within the altar of the old village church there stands a white marble tablet, which bears as yet but one word, Agnes. There is no coffin in that tomb, and may it be many, many years before another name is placed above it. But if the spirits of the dead ever come back to earth to visit spots hallowed by the love beyond the grave of those whom they knew in life, I believe that the shade of Agnes sometimes hovers round that solemn nook. I believe it none the less because that nook is in a church, and she was weak and erring.